Consider the grand story of our past, the chronicle we call history. We are raised to view it as an unshakable truth, a solid foundation upon which our understanding of the world is built. But is it truly so solid? Or is it more akin to a magnificent tapestry, woven not only with threads of fact, but with the darker strands of ambition, power, and pervasive fear? Contemplate how many irreplaceable treasures of knowledge have been consigned to the flames simply to safeguard the fragile pride of conquerors. Imagine the countless maps, statues, and ancient texts that have been quietly disappeared because they posed inconvenient questions, challenging the established order. What if every one of these lost pieces were to suddenly come to light? Our entire conception of the world might be irrevocably overturned. This is not an exploration of cheap conspiracy theories. It is a deep journey into the undeniable instances of historical suppression, those moments when the truth was deliberately edited, when our collective human memory was meticulously redefined to serve a new and greater power. There is a profound paradox that few are willing to confront. History is not merely a record of what occurred, but a curated collection of what powerful people decided was permissible to be told. From the dawn of civilization, the wielding of power has always carried with it the privilege of shaping memory. Emperors, religious institutions, dynasties, and entire empires did not only erect monuments to broadcast their triumphs. They also burned libraries to the ground, methodically scraped names from stone monuments, and surgically excised their rivals from every available record. This was not a process of random forgetting. It was a silent, patient project of demolition, carried out with a destructive force more enduring than any sword or siege engine. When a civilization finally crumbles, we tend to remember the falling walls and the blackened ruins of its temples. But the first casualty, the thing that always burns most fiercely, is memory itself. A single lost manuscript can sever a chain of understanding that stretches back for thousands of years. A subtly revised timeline can effectively erase the legacy of an entire culture. And a story that is branded as heresy soon becomes a forbidden taboo, surviving only as a fearful, trembling whisper past in the shadows. Some of these scars on our history are too vast to be ignored, like the incandescent glow of the Library of Alexandria burning against the night sky, or the countless archives buried deep within the fortified vaults of the Vatican. But there are also subtler wounds, quieter acts of erasure. A groundbreaking research paper that is never published, an ancient map dismissed as a work of imaginative fiction, an uncomfortable archaeological question gently removed from an academic curriculum to sidestep controversy. With every such act, the past is bent just a little more. Over time, we're conditioned to believe that history is a clear, linear progression of events, absolute and unchanging. The reality is far more complex, a landscape of contradictions, shadows, and silences. It is this silence, this absence of questioning, that should frighten us the most. Because when no one dares to ask what has been concealed, the keepers of memory no longer need to set any books aflame. They need only wait for the next generation to forget that there was ever another story to be told. So, ask yourself, who holds the pen that writes the single chronicle the entirety of humanity is compelled to believe? Are you prepared? Because once this door is opened, you will never see the past in the same way again. When we conjure an image of the Library of Alexandria, we often see a vast, sacred repository of ancient wisdom, a sanctuary filled with priceless papyrus scrolls. These scrolls held works of unparalleled genius on astronomy, geography, medicine, philosophy, linguistics, and legends from distant lands, gathered from every corner of the world touched by the expanding Greek and, later, Roman empires. Some historical estimates suggest that at its zenith, the library contained over 700,000 scrolls, an astronomical figure that dwarfs any other collection of its era. But what truly haunts us today is not merely the immense scale of its archives, but the mysterious and tragic circumstances of its demise. The burning of Alexandria's library has become a powerful symbol of immeasurable human loss, not just of ink and parchment, but of entire chains of memory and forgotten truths that were brutally stripped from all future generations. According to the accounts that have survived the ages, the first major destruction happened around 48 BCE, during Julius Caesar's military siege of the city. A fire that began in the harbor spread uncontrollably into nearby warehouses, consuming tens of thousands of scrolls in a single catastrophic blaze. But this was not the final disaster. A series of subsequent events, including Aurelian's invasion, the decree by Theophilus banning all pagan beliefs, and ultimately the Arab conquest, each chipped away more of the library's magnificent legacy, like successive waves eroding a sandy shore until nothing remains. Yet, a growing number of modern scholars contend that these were not all just unfortunate accidents of war. Some compelling theories suggest that there was a deliberate and systematic effort to annihilate pluralistic knowledge, a kind of knowledge that dared to question divine authority, challenged the permanence of political power, and offered alternative origin myths to those of the rising monotheistic religions. Why, some historians ask, were so many unique and irreplaceable manuscripts from Egypt, Persia, Assyria, and lands far beyond the Mediterranean so diligently gathered in Alexandria? And why did they all seem to vanish in unison? Was it merely a coincidence that towards the twilight of the Roman Empire, powerful Christian clergy began to view the preservation of pagan teachings as an existential threat that needed to be utterly eradicated? There is some indirect evidence, found in scattered letters from Alexandrian philosophers and Roman scholars, that hints at scrolls being smuggled out and hidden before the fires. But no one knows where these precious texts might have gone. Other theories propose that the most dangerous works, those that directly challenge religious or political dogma, were intentionally destroyed first. Then, the fires were allowed to rage through the remaining collections, effectively erasing all evidence of a targeted purge in one final, all-consuming inferno. You could imagine the library as a flawless mirror, one that reflected the world with too much clarity, too much unflinching truth for those in power to tolerate its continued existence. Within its hallowed walls were alternative creation myths, cosmological models that did not place humankind at the center of the universe, and detailed records of parallel civilizations that had thrived for centuries without submitting to any single, overarching authority. Had those fragments of our past survived, the story of humanity might be told very differently today, not as a neat, linear progression of chosen empires, but as a rich, tangled, and magnificent tapestry of competing ideas and discoveries. All that remains now are scattered fragments, passing references in other texts, and mournful letters from scholars lamenting their profound loss. Centuries have elapsed, yet the debate over what truly transpired still burns with an intense fire of its own. Was it a tragic accident, a stray spark in the chaos of conflict? Or was it a carefully orchestrated operation to clear the collective memory, making way for a new declaration of absolute power? That question continues to linger, defying every attempt at closure. It leaves behind a vast, aching emptiness, a void not just of missing pages, but of the very belief that knowledge can survive, so long as no one makes it their mission to destroy it. Following the tragic story of Alexandria, few people are aware that during the very same era, in another corner of the Hellenistic world, a second great library arose to become its formidable rival, Pergamon. Perched high upon a wind-swept acropolis in Anatolia, the city of Pergamon was not merely the capital of a powerful kingdom. It was a vibrant cultural epicenter where the ambition to accumulate all knowledge was pushed to its absolute limits. At its peak, the Library of Pergamon housed an estimated 200,000 scrolls, making it the second largest repository of wisdom in the ancient world, surpassed only by its great rival in Alexandria. The historian Pliny the Elder recorded that the kings of the Attalid dynasty dispatched agents across Greece, Egypt, and Asia Minor with a singular mission: to purchase or painstakingly copy any manuscript they could find, treating every scrap of written knowledge as a prize more precious than gold. This relentless ambition, however, thrust Pergamon into the heart of a quiet but fierce rivalry, a conflict some modern scholars have dubbed the Library Wars. According to the geographer Strabo, Egypt's Ptolemy V eventually banned the export of papyrus to Pergamon in a calculated attempt to stifle its growth. Cut off from their traditional writing material, the innovative scholars of Pergamon developed a new medium, pergamena, or parchment, crafted from finely treated animal skins. In retaliation, Pergamon aggressively pursued the rarest manuscripts, especially those that Alexandria had not yet managed to acquire. This was far more than a simple academic competition. It was a battle of soft power. Whichever kingdom controlled the largest trove of knowledge would hold the upper hand in shaping intellectual authority across the entire ancient world. But Pergamon's golden age began to wane as Roman influence steadily crept into Asia Minor. In the year 133 BCE, upon the death of King Attalus III, the entire kingdom of Pergamon was bequeathed to Rome through his will, a move that set the stage for its full annexation. And just before this momentous transfer of power, something very strange occurred. A significant portion of Pergamon's most valuable manuscripts seems to have vanished into thin air. According to accounts by Plutarch and scattered correspondence that has survived the ages, many scrolls were either removed under the cover of darkness or destroyed outright. The most widely accepted theory suggests this was an intentional purge, a last desperate act of defiance meant to deny Rome the ability to use Pergamon's immense cultural capital as a tool of political control. Others have proposed a different scenario, that Roman envoys themselves collected and redistributed the works, transferring them to Rome or even to Alexandria, which by then had also fallen under Roman influence, in a strategic move to centralize all knowledge within the empire's firm grasp. Whatever the truth may be, the outcome was the same. Much of Pergamon's extraordinary intellectual legacy was never seen again. Its detailed catalogs disappeared. Original works by renowned philosophers, historians, physicians, and poets vanished completely from the Roman historical record. In the shadowy transitions of power, knowledge became a silent hostage, not merely taken from its home community, but absorbed into another archive where a new authority held absolute power over what would be preserved, what would be allowed to rot, and what would be erased from memory for all time. One modern scholar eloquently remarked, "If Alexandria was the story of a treasure burned to ash, Pergamon was the tragedy of a treasure dismantled layer by layer, quietly and systematically, until only the cold stone walls remained as silent witnesses in that profound silence." It becomes nearly impossible for future generations to distinguish between what was lost naturally to the passage of time and what was deliberately erased in a calculated effort to monopolize knowledge. If the theories hold true, the cleansing of Pergamon's library before its handover to Rome may have been a strategy to ensure that later generations would never access the uncensored stories, the narratives that might have challenged the official history that was then being written. This leaves us with a chilling question. How many times in history has knowledge been buried? Not because it was useless, but because it was far too dangerous for a new order to tolerate its existence? Pergamon is just one example, but it serves as a stark reminder that the collective knowledge of humanity is far more fragile than we dare to imagine. And sometimes, real power isn't in possessing the information, but in deciding who is allowed to know it. After the destruction of Greco-Roman knowledge in both Alexandria and Pergamon, our attention shifts eastward to another immense and highly refined body of literature, the early Buddhist manuscripts of ancient India. Starting in the 3rd century BCE, under the Mauryan Empire and the enlightened reign of Emperor Ashoka, Buddhist scriptures were meticulously compiled and disseminated across the entire Indian subcontinent. Monks, royal envoys, and dedicated scholars carried handwritten texts, often recorded on delicate palm leaves, bark paper, or etched into enduring stone pillars. According to early historical records, these precious manuscripts were carefully preserved in major monastic centers of learning, such as Nalanda, Vikramashala, Odanapuri, and numerous smaller institutions spread throughout India. For centuries, these archives were believed to contain the most complete and unaltered collections of early Buddhist teachings, including the sutras in their original form and early commentaries that retained their true, unadulterated semantic depth. And yet, the vast majority of these foundational manuscripts have completely vanished. Scholars argue that this staggering loss cannot be explained away solely by the ravages of time, a harsh climate, or natural decay. In the 12th century, India experienced violent upheavals as Turkish and Afghan Muslim forces swept across the region. Monasteries were systematically attacked, their libraries burned, and monks were either slaughtered or forced to flee for their lives. In the 13th century, the Persian historian Minhaj-i-Siraj described the horrific destruction of Nalanda not merely as a massacre, but as a calculated and systematic effort to obliterate the intellectual foundations of Buddhism, which were seen as obstacles to the process of Islamization. He wrote that the flames that engulfed Nalanda's great library smoldered for 3 long months, and that even from a great distance, passers-by could smell the acrid scent of burning ancient paper carried on the wind. But what puzzles modern researchers even more is the conspicuous lack of surviving records concerning the manuscripts that monks may have managed to rescue before the invasions. Some legends suggest that in a desperate effort to preserve the Dharma, monks fled eastward, carrying precious scriptures into the remote mountain kingdoms of Nepal, Bhutan, and Tibet. Others speculate that a significant number of texts were carefully hidden in remote Himalayan caves, patiently waiting for the right moment to re-emerge into the world. Yet, centuries have passed, and no reliable evidence has ever surfaced to prove that these original manuscripts were ever recovered. What remains today are mostly later transcriptions, often heavily edited, translated into Chinese or Tibetan, or reinterpreted through the lens of different schools of thought. As a consequence, scholars can no longer be certain which versions truly reflect the Buddha's earliest teachings and which have been subtly reshaped over the course of time. Some historians of religion argue that the loss of early Buddhist knowledge was not just a result of war, but also of intense rivalries between different Buddhist schools and shifting political agendas. Each new dynasty that came to power had its own reasons to favor certain texts while ignoring others. Commentaries or philosophical critiques that challenged the orthodox views of the time were often deemed dangerous, potentially divisive, and were deliberately left out of large-scale copying projects. For many centuries, the transmission of Buddhist teachings was not a neutral or objective process. It was actively shaped by the powerful forces of religion, politics, and academic control. No one can say for sure how much truth was quietly trimmed away or concealed, even while resting on the library shelves of the great monasteries. This silent disappearance leaves behind a deep and profound void in our understanding of early Buddhism. Had the original manuscript survived, we might now see a very different picture of how Buddhist thought initially formed and spread, perhaps a richer variety of early schools, or deeper, more explicit ties between Buddhism and pre-Vedic Indian philosophy. Today, archaeologists continue to uncover the ruins of Nalanda and Vikramashala. They find remnants of bookshelf pedestals and foundational stone blocks that once supported vast libraries. But the most vital parts, the pages, the words, the subtle insights, have vanished without a trace. Their absence suggests not just simple neglect, but a strategic erasure of collective memory, executed so quietly and efficiently that no one has ever been able to name the hand that started the fire. Like the stories of Alexandria and Pergamon, the tale of India's lost Buddhist manuscripts is not only a tragedy of knowledge destroyed, it is a powerful reminder that the history of ideas has never been immune to the corrupting touch of power. In the end, we are left with a single, haunting question. Were those scriptures truly burned to ash? Or are they still out there, sleeping in some hidden mountain hollow, waiting for a time when humanity is finally brave enough to face the full and complete memory of itself? If Alexandria, Pergamon, and the Buddhist monasteries fell victim to war and covert campaigns to control knowledge, ancient China witnessed something even more chilling. a state-sponsored, publicly declared, and historically recorded purge of knowledge. This was the infamous burning of the books and burying of the scholars, under the rule of Emperor Qin Shi Huang. This was not a mere symbolic act. It was, in its scope and intent, one of the most extreme and methodical efforts to erase collective memory ever recorded in human history. According to the records of the Grand Historian by Sima Qian, the decree was issued in 213 BCE, just after the Qin dynasty had unified the fractured warring states into a single, formidable empire. The stated objective was to unify thought in order to support the newly established regime. However, many scholars today believe it was also a calculated and ruthless move to eliminate all historical reference points and to suppress any intellectual challenge to the emperor's absolute legitimacy. The event began at the council of Prime Minister Li Si, a staunch legalist who firmly believed in ruling through strict law and absolute ideological conformity. Li Si feared that Confucian scholars and other rival schools of thought were still secretly passing down the histories and philosophies of the former states, thereby sowing seeds of doubt about the righteousness of Qin rule. The edict was uncompromising. With the exception of books on agriculture, medicine, divination, and engineering, all historical records, poetry, and classical texts from the former kingdoms would be surrendered for immediate destruction. Anyone caught hiding such materials faced the harshest of punishments. Within months, an enormous number of texts, written on bamboo strips and parchment, were collected in the capital of Xianyang and burned in massive public bonfires at the imperial court. In those towering flames, it wasn't just bamboo and paper that turned to ash. It was the spiritual and intellectual legacy of hundreds of years. Philosophies on virtue and music, detailed historical chronicles, profound reflections on morality and human order. All were systematically erased so that history could be rewritten under a single, monolithic imperial narrative. It is said that on that night, the red glow of the burning books lit up the entire horizon, while scholars watched helplessly, unable to speak out without risking their own lives. A year later, the regime carried out a second, even darker act: the mass execution of Confucian scholars, who were reportedly buried alive as a brutal and unmistakable warning that no dissent against the emperor's authority would ever be tolerated. However, it is important to note that the records from the subsequent Han dynasty, which replaced the Qin, may not be entirely objective. Some modern historians suggest that the scope of this purge was deliberately exaggerated, perhaps as a form of propaganda to vilify Qin Shi Huang and thereby legitimize the Han's own rise to power. Archaeological finds have indeed confirmed that certain texts managed to survive in remote regions, hidden by local officials or noble families who defied the edict. Yet, even if the extent of the destruction was embellished, the core truth remains undeniable. The Qin dynasty set a dangerous and terrifying precedent, a centralized power claiming the absolute right to decide which knowledge could be preserved and which must vanish forever. What makes this event especially distinct from other purges of knowledge is its open declaration and its blunt, unapologetic justification. No excuse of war or religion was deemed necessary. The regime plainly stated that intellectual pluralism was a direct threat to authority. From that moment forward, an empire that built the Great Wall and engineered massive infrastructure projects also planted a deep seed of instability within its own foundations, because no order built upon forced amnesia can ever remain truly stable. Today, as archaeologists carefully examine the ruins of Xianyang and sift through the few surviving bamboo strips, profound questions linger. How many invaluable texts were lost forever before they could be copied? How much ancient knowledge on astronomy, philosophy, governance, and ethics was reduced to nothing more than ash and smoke? And deeper still, did those flames truly succeed in suppressing thought, or did they instead fuel an unquenchable longing in future generations to recover a stolen memory? The Qin book burning stands as one of the clearest examples of a recurring truth in human history. When power reaches its zenith, it seeks not only to rule the land, but to rule memory itself, and to control the very language of truth. And from the ashes of those ancient texts, a question still rises. What else remains buried in the shadows, waiting to be unearthed, to reveal the true origins of an empire? After the fire of Xianyang consumed the collective memory of ancient China, history bore witness to yet another profound tragedy. This time, it unfolded across the ocean, amidst the dense jungles and towering stone pyramids of the Maya civilization. Few people realize that Mesoamerica once housed thousands of intricate and beautiful manuscripts, known as codices, made from bark paper called amatl, which was coated with a fine white lime plaster and inscribed with one of the most complex hieroglyphic systems in the ancient Americas. Each codex was far more than just a religious text. It held detailed knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, intricate calendrical systems, and the royal chronicles of dynasties, representing a vast treasury of wisdom developed over many centuries. And today, we understand only a tiny fraction of what was tragically lost. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Yucatan Peninsula in the early 16th century, the fate of this incredible body of knowledge was sealed. In the name of Christian evangelization and the consolidation of colonial power, the Spanish clergy systematically labeled the Maya manuscripts as demonic heresy. The most infamous event of this cultural genocide occurred in 1562 when Bishop Diego de Landa ordered a massive book burning in the town of Monte. In his own writings, Relation de las Cosas de Yucatan, de Landa described how he collected every Maya codex he could find and had them burned in a great public bonfire, believing them to contain nothing but the lies of the devil, hundreds of years of accumulated wisdom, painstakingly preserved in delicate bark paper scrolls, were reduced to ash, while Maya elders and scribes were tortured to force them to reveal their sacred rites. The bitter irony of this story is that Diego de Landa, the man who personally orchestrated the destruction of most of the Maya's written legacy, is also the one who left behind the most detailed account of their complex writing system, a paradox that continues to provoke intense debate among scholars to this day. It wasn't until the 20th century that modern researchers were finally able to decode parts of the Maya script. But without the original codices, there is simply not enough material to fully reconstruct their sophisticated calendar systems or their detailed historical records. Out of the thousands of manuscripts that once existed, only 4 codices are known to have survived: the Dresden Codex, the Madrid Codex, the Paris Codex, and the Grolier Codex. All of them are now housed in European museums, a stark and painful reminder that the knowledge created by the Maya people no longer belongs to the descendants of its creators. Some modern historians argue that this destruction was not driven purely by religious fervor, but was also part of a deliberate and strategic cultural erasure. By forcing the native populations to convert, the colonizers stripped them not only of their gods, but also of the written memory of their origins, their ancestry, and their claims to land ownership. In the context of colonization, knowledge itself became a powerful tool of control. Whoever controls history controls identity. The burning of the books, then, was not merely symbolic. It was strategic, designed to redefine and ultimately subjugate the identity of an entire civilization. Today, when we walk through the magnificent ruins of Palenque, Copan, or Tikal, it is impossible not to wonder how many stories were lost forever in that fire. Advanced astronomical charts, epic dynastic histories, complex formulas for predicting eclipse cycles, detailed agricultural rituals, all reduced to smoke and memory. Researchers may never be able to grasp the full depth and complexity of Maya thought. Each codex that was destroyed was a missing piece of a vast, unfinished puzzle. And here lies the final, haunting paradox. To reconstruct Maya history, scholars have had to rely on the writings of the very man who ordered its destruction. With all his biases and fervent religious zeal, de Landa still left behind a glyph key, the only tool that enabled the 20th century to begin the arduous process of decoding this lost world. But the burned pages will never return. and no one can say for certain how many secrets still lie buried beneath the ashes, unrecoverable and forever silent. This story raises a question with no satisfying answer. Was the fire at Mani simply the inevitable result of a tragic clash of civilizations and faiths? Or was it part of a deliberate strategy to ensure that Mayan knowledge could never again challenge the colonial narratives or demand its own rightful place in the world? And if that fire had never been lit, would we now see the pre-Columbian history of the Americas with clearer, less distorted eyes? After the fires that consumed the Maya codices, the story of erased knowledge takes us back across the ocean to a text that was once widely embraced by early Jewish and Christian communities, only to vanish abruptly from the official Bible. This is the story of the Book of Enoch, a manuscript that was both deeply revered and harshly rejected. According to tradition, Enoch was the seventh patriarch after Adam, a man so righteous that he walked with God and was taken up to heaven without ever experiencing death. But what makes the Book of Enoch so extraordinary is not just its mythic tone. It's the complex cosmic worldview and the radical theological ideas it contains, concepts that clash profoundly with the doctrines that would later come to dominate organized religion. Also known as 1 Enoch or the Ethiopic Book of Enoch, the text is a composite of several distinct sections, the most famous being the Book of the Watchers and the Book of the Luminaries. These writings tell a dramatic story of a group of angels, known as the Watchers, who were sent to earth but fell into temptation. They taught humans forbidden knowledge, including metallurgy, advanced astronomy, ritual practices, and the arts of war. The result, according to the text, was an age of widespread corruption and chaos that culminated in the Great Flood. These narratives posed a series of unsettling questions for the emerging religious authorities. If God's plan for salvation was singular and sovereign, how could there be rogue angels acting independently, gifting humanity with sacred knowledge? And if humanity was ultimately punished for acquiring this knowledge, where exactly was the line drawn between divine wisdom and unforgivable sin? During the first few centuries of the Common Era, the Book of Enoch was widely read and respected by early Christian communities and by ascetic groups like the Essenes at Qumran. Fragments of it were even quoted directly in the New Testament. The Epistle of Jude, for example, directly cites a prophecy from Enoch, signaling its once prominent and authoritative status. But by the 4th century, at the influential councils of Nicaea and Laodicea, the book was formally excluded from the official biblical canon, deemed to be of uncertain origin and containing heretical ideas. From that point on, copying and distributing the text was strictly banned. In the Latin and Greek Christian worlds, it faded into almost total obscurity. Only the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church preserved it, maintaining the ancient Guizi version as a canonical part of their biblical tradition. To the rest of Christendom, Enoch became an apocryphal and dangerous work, surrounded by rumors and deep theological discomfort. For over 1,500 years, European scholars only encountered the Book of Enoch through vague and tantalizing references, until the 18th century when the Scottish explorer James Bruce brought several handwritten copies back from Ethiopia. The discovery stunned the academic world, offering the first full and breathtaking glimpse of a text that contained elaborate cosmologies, complex numerological mysticism, and sophisticated portrayals of supernatural beings. Some scholars argue that the suppression of the Book of Enoch was not just a theological decision, but was part of a broader, more calculated strategy to control religious knowledge. As the early church sought to define a single, unified, and unshakable dogma, any text that referenced forbidden knowledge or powerful spiritual forces existing beyond direct divine control posed a significant threat. If knowledge could be imparted to humanity outside of God's direct will, the Church's exclusive claim to be the sole arbiter of salvation would begin to falter. In this light, the Book of Enoch had to disappear to prevent it from opening a door to questions that extended far beyond the approved theology. Today, as we study the surviving text, we can hear echoes of Babylonian, Egyptian, and even pre-Judaic mysticism within its pages, suggesting that the Book of Enoch may have been a bridge between ancient wisdom traditions that have long since been severed. And the questions remain. How many lost versions of the book once existed? Did earlier variants explore even more radical ideas about the origin of human knowledge? And, most importantly, if the Book of Enoch had never been suppressed, would our understanding of religious history look completely different? The long and deafening silence that surrounded Enoch until the 18th century is definitive proof that not all knowledge is lost in fire. Some is deliberately buried in darkness, sealed off by those who possess the power to define what is allowed to count as truth. In the end, we are left with a series of unsettling questions. How many other pages of sacred knowledge once existed, only to be quietly removed from the record so that history could be flattened, simplified, and made easier to control? If the disappearance of the Book of Enoch evokes an image of forgotten wisdom deliberately buried in silence, then the story of the Gnostic texts is far more dramatic. It is a tale of a deliberate, highly organized, and ruthless campaign to erase an entire stream of spiritual knowledge, all in the name of protecting the one true faith. Gnosticism, or the Gnostic tradition, flourished in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, as communities from Egypt to Asia Minor began to offer radically different interpretations of the universe, the divine, and the human condition, ideas that clashed sharply with the emerging orthodoxy of the early Christian church. To the Gnostics, the material world was not the perfect creation of an all-powerful and benevolent God, but the flawed and corrupt construct of a lesser, ignorant being known as the demiurge. They believed that the human soul, a spark of divine light, was trapped within the prison of the body, and only through gnosis, a form of mystical, hidden knowledge, could it ascend back to a higher, purer divine realm. To the early church fathers, these ideas were not just simple doctrinal errors. They were profound theological threats. If salvation could be found from within, through personal revelation, without the need for the church's sacraments and intermediaries, the entire institutional foundation of its authority would begin to crumble. Gnostic texts circulated among tightly knit, secretive communities, meticulously copied onto precious papyrus scrolls. They recorded mystical dialogues and profound revelations, many of which were believed to be secret teachings given by Jesus himself to his most trusted disciples, those capable of decoding their deeper, allegorical meaning. The Gnostic library was vast and diverse, including works like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Truth, and the Apocalypse of Adam, among many others. The Gospel of Thomas, in particular, was highly controversial for its declaration that the kingdom of God resides within each person, a statement that implied no mediator was required. By the late 2nd century, influential church leaders like Irenaeus recognized the growing influence of these heretical texts and began a fierce and systematic campaign to eliminate them. Gnostic writings were condemned as forgeries designed to mislead the faithful, and anyone caught copying or preserving them faced severe penalties, including excommunication or even execution. Over the centuries, most of these manuscripts were systematically destroyed, seized in raids on monasteries, or buried in secret by their followers to escape persecution. This campaign of erasure was so ruthlessly effective that for over a millennium, the only knowledge the world had of Gnosticism came from the hostile and biased writings of its enemies. That all changed dramatically in 1945, when an Egyptian farmer digging near the Nile River stumbled upon a large, sealed clay jar containing 13 leather-bound papyrus codices, the now famous Nag Hammadi Library. Inside were over 50 Gnostic texts, preserved almost entirely intact, containing sayings, revelations, and philosophical discourses that had never before been seen by modern scholars. When these texts were finally translated into English and other languages, they revealed a rich, complex, and deeply metaphysical worldview, a cosmos woven from realms of light, where souls were born of a divine realm far above, and where earthly power, including religious institutions, was often viewed as a mechanism of spiritual imprisonment. For many researchers, This monumental discovery radically expanded our understanding of early Christianity, revealing a vibrant plurality of voices that existed before a single, orthodox version of the faith rose to dominance. Some scholars caution against romanticizing Gnosticism as a wholly innocent or persecuted movement. Many Gnostic groups were themselves insular and elitist, claiming to possess exclusive access to the ultimate truth. But one thing is undeniably clear. For over 1,000 years, anyone who dared to copy or preserve Gnostic writings risked death or total expulsion from the religious world. Today, as the Nag Hammadi texts circulate freely in modern languages, a deeper question emerges. If these texts had not been so thoroughly destroyed, would Christian history still appear to us as a single, linear thread, or would it look more like a vibrant chorus of competing truths? More profoundly, the Church's willingness to ban dozens of works outright demonstrates that religious authority has often been built not just through preaching, but through the aggressive gatekeeping of memory, by deciding what is allowed to exist in the collective mind. The Gnostic story leaves us with a question that echoes across time. Were the scribes and their texts hunted down to protect the faith or to protect its power? And if a lost memory can rise again from a forgotten clay jar, how many other fragments of our past still wait to be unearthed, ready to shake the very foundations of what we think is the only history? If the story of the Gnostic texts reveals a deliberate and systematic effort to suppress opposing religious knowledge, the tale of Babylon's lost writings exposes another dimension of this phenomenon entirely, one where vast treasures of ancient knowledge simply vanish without a trace, and centuries later, an eerie and persistent silence surrounds anyone bold enough to ask why. Babylon, the legendary city that once stood proudly along the banks of the Euphrates River, was the intellectual crown jewel of Mesopotamia. Its highly skilled scholars etched thousands upon thousands of clay tablets, preserving an immense body of knowledge in astronomy, mathematics, law, medicine, and mythology. At the height of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, under the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II, the royal library and dozens of temple archives are believed to have held some of the oldest known versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh, as well as detailed ritual texts and long dynastic chronicles that dated all the way back to the Sumerian, Akkadian, and Assyrian eras. When the Persian Empire conquered Babylon in 539 BCE, many of these records were reportedly copied and taken to the Persian capital of Persepolis. Later, Alexander the Great's campaigns led to the further collection and displacement of these ancient texts, many of which disappeared during the chaotic power struggles that followed his death. And yet, many scholars believe that large caches of these cuneiform tablets remained sealed and untouched for centuries in hidden chambers buried deep beneath the city's ruins. In the 19th century, British and French expeditions began to excavate the site of ancient Babylon. But from the very beginning, a series of inconsistencies and contradictions emerged surrounding what was actually found and what was officially reported. Famed archaeologists like Hormizd Rassam and Robert Coldway documented the recovery of thousands of clay tablets, so many that they could not possibly be cataloged in a timely manner. Early field reports hinted at the discovery of previously unknown chronicles, detailing dynasties and historical events that did not align with the then-accepted narrative of Babylonian and Assyrian history. According to some independent researchers, these inconvenient texts slowly began to disappear. They were either quietly buried in the backroom archives of institutions like the British Museum and Berlin's Pergamon Museum, or they were scattered into private collections, their contents never fully disclosed to the public. Part of the controversy stems from the continued reluctance of some academic institutions to release or even acknowledge the existence of certain materials. Many tablets were given generic classifications, such as administrative records or commercial accounts, with no published photographs or transliterations ever being made available. Modern Assyriologists often cite a lack of manpower as the reason for the delay in translating the overwhelming number of tablets. But skeptics continue to ask, if these are just routine receipts, why the profound secrecy? Could some of these tablets contain chronologies, myths, or astronomical records that would fundamentally challenge the foundational assumptions about Mesopotamian civilization. The story grows even murkier with persistent reports of Babylonian tablets appearing in private auctions across Europe and the United States, only to vanish again into the personal vaults of wealthy collectors. In recent years, some of these fragments have resurfaced through legal disputes over artifact ownership. Among them are texts that reveal previously unknown rituals and detailed accounts of cometary cycles, with descriptions that rival or even predate what 19th century Western astronomers believed were modern discoveries. The paradox is striking. In a modern archaeological world that supposedly prizes transparency, some institutions maintain a total and unwavering silence on the fate of Babylon's more mysterious writings. Some scholars have even coined the term academic gray zone, a realm where artifacts are known to exist but remain unnamed, unpublished, and inaccessible to outside researchers. Within this zone, speculation flourishes, with theories ranging from simple bureaucratic delay to intentional suppression, born from a fear that certain findings might destabilize the historical narrative that modern scholarship has so carefully constructed over the last century. Today, as young researchers walk through the ruins of Babylon, they continue to ask the same questions. If these ancient records were ever fully translated and made public, how much of Mesopotamian and even Near Eastern prehistory would have to be completely rewritten? And, more deeply, is the long silence surrounding these texts just a byproduct of chaotic 19th century excavation practices? Or is it quiet but compelling evidence of a protective effort to preserve the familiar framework of knowledge by withholding truths that do not fit neatly within it? Following the debates that surround Babylon's lost texts and the enduring silence of academia, our journey now leads us to yet another extraordinary discovery. This time, it was not hidden away in ancient royal archives, but was found buried deep within a dry cave near the desolate shores of the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered between 1947 and 1956, are widely known for containing the earliest surviving manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible and numerous other Jewish texts from the Second Temple period. But among the hundreds of fragile parchment and papyrus fragments, there is one object that is utterly unlike any other, the only scroll to be engraved on metal, an artifact that has sparked endless speculation and intense controversy ever since its discovery: the Copper Scroll. Unlike the other scrolls, which focus on theology, sectarian rules, or legal codes, the Copper Scroll is entirely practical in its nature. It lists approximately 60 secret locations, each paired with detailed inventories of vast quantities of gold, silver, and other precious objects, all supposedly hidden in caves, underground chambers, and ancient ruins scattered throughout Jerusalem and the stark Judean desert. According to the text, the total treasure amounts to dozens of tons of precious metals, a staggering quantity that even the most cautious archaeologists admit is utterly baffling. Since its discovery in Cave 3 at Qumran in 1952, the Copper Scroll has undergone a long and arduous decoding process. Due to severe oxidation, experts were forced to carefully cut the scroll into separate segments just to be able to read the intricate inscription. In 1956, the lead researcher, Yosef Milik, released the first official translation, asserting that it was indeed a literal inventory of a massive hidden treasure. And yet, for decades, no official archaeological effort, not by Jordan, not by Israel, nor by any international academic institution, has ever made a public and concerted attempt to locate the treasure it describes. Scholars remain sharply divided on its meaning. Some believe the scroll is purely symbolic, perhaps a religious metaphor or a set of ceremonial instructions. Others, including the late archaeologist Vendell Jones, have insisted that the list is entirely real, possibly detailing treasures that were hidden by the Essenes or by Jewish priestly factions during the Roman siege and the catastrophic destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. There have been hints in Israeli records of quiet, unofficial investigations of certain sites mentioned in the scroll, but their findings have never been fully disclosed to the public. This raises a troubling question. If the Copper Scroll is merely symbolic, why was it engraved on metal? This was an expensive and rare preservation method, reserved only for texts of immense and lasting importance. And if the treasure, worth billions in modern value, were real, what has stopped governments and institutions from pursuing it? Some theories suggest that verifying the scroll's claims could lead to incredibly complex religious and legal disputes, especially involving the sovereignty of Jerusalem and competing claims over ancient Jewish heritage. Others propose a more cautious explanation, revealing that the treasure was never found, or worse, that was removed long ago, could diminish the mythic aura of the scroll, thereby undermining the symbolic power of the entire Dead Sea Scrolls collection. And as history often shows, ambiguity fuels allure. Today, the original Copper Scroll is housed in the Jordan Museum in Amman, while replicas, photographs, and translations are displayed in institutions around the world. But the locations it describes, from the tomb in the Valley of Acre to the cave marked by 2 stone pillars, remain unexcavated, or at the very least, no verified findings have ever been made public. Among archaeologists, many will quietly admit that the topic is simply too sensitive, not merely because of the potential monetary value, but because it touches upon the theological and historical legitimacy of one of the most hotly contested regions on Earth. Thus, the story of the Copper Scroll becomes yet another potent symbol of how knowledge can be effectively suppressed, not by fire, not by censorship, but by a quiet, coordinated silence among those who have the most to lose if the full truth were ever to be revealed. And once again, we are left with a familiar and haunting question. Will a forgotten fragment of the past ever rise to shatter the thick fog of legend? Or will the truth remain sealed away, buried forever beneath the thick dust of closed archives? From the profound mystery of the Copper Scroll and its untouched treasure sites near the Dead Sea, history now leads us to one of the most hotly debated and controversial topics of all: the numerous reports of giant human skeletons being unearthed across the United States, only to vanish under the most puzzling of circumstances. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, dozens of newspapers, archaeological journals, and local historical records reported a series of stunning discoveries. These were human remains measuring between 8 and 10 feet in height, often found buried alongside sophisticated weapons, intricate jewelry, and other finely crafted artifacts. Some of the most frequently cited sources for these reports include the New York Times, Scientific American, and various regional papers like the Nevada Tribune. In 1877, a correspondent reported the discovery of a giant skeleton within a tomb in Eureka, Nevada. In 1891, massive bones were allegedly unearthed at the Cahokia Mounds in Illinois. Throughout the Ohio Valley and the ancient mound regions of Indiana, similar reports continued to emerge, painting a picture of a forgotten race of giants. What makes this story even more complex is the alleged involvement of one of America's most respected scientific institutions, the Smithsonian Institution. According to various accounts from the period, Smithsonian representatives were often quick to arrive at these dig sites and take custody of the remains for further research and preservation. But despite the sensational headlines, none of these extraordinary skeletons ever appeared in any public exhibitions or were ever detailed in official Smithsonian reports. Over time, they simply disappeared, surviving only in old newspaper clippings and the fading oral histories of local communities. This conspicuous opacity fueled countless theories. Many authors and independent researchers have claimed that the Smithsonian and possibly other federal research entities deliberately destroyed the remains and their associated artifacts because they fundamentally challenged the foundational assumptions of modern anthropology, which firmly rejects the existence of a parallel race of giants in prehistoric North America. In 2014, an article caused a significant stir when it claimed that the Smithsonian had been forced by a court order to admit to destroying thousands of these anomalous skeletons. The institution swiftly responded, calling the story an outright hoax and firmly denying the existence of any such records or remains. Still, Skeptics argue that a denial is not the same as disproof. They point out that many artifacts have been lost to the ravages of time within vast, underfunded museum archives, with some remaining uncatalogued and others simply misfiled into oblivion. Independent historians suggest that the late 19th and early 20th centuries were formative years for both evolutionary theory and modern anthropology. Any discoveries that disrupted the emerging rational and linear picture of human origins may have been quietly dismissed as unreliable, deliberately ignored, or suppressed. Thus, the image of the giant skeleton has become a potent symbol of that murky space, where folklore collides with institutional control over knowledge. Among various Native American tribes, such as the Iroquois and the Choctaw, there are long-standing legends of a race of red-haired giants who once ruled the land before being wiped out. And when reports of large skeletons began to appear in the very same regions described in these ancient myths, the line between history and collective imagination became increasingly difficult to draw. Today, the ancient mound structures still the landscape of the American Midwest, and local museums occasionally display odd relics, such as unusually thick bone fragments or oversized stone tools. But no complete giant skeleton has ever been independently verified, transparently preserved, or made available for open academic review. This glaring absence of evidence only serves to deepen the intrigue, fueling both suspicion and fascination. And like the story of the Copper Scroll, this mystery leads us back to a familiar question. Was the disappearance of this evidence a mere coincidence, simply a byproduct of the chaotic early days of archaeology? Or was it part of a conscious and concerted effort to keep human history neatly contained within its familiar and comfortable boundaries? In the quiet spaces between these questions, the grassy mounds, untouched and unmarked, stand like anonymous tombstones, challenging us to dig deeper, even if we're not truly ready for what we might find. After the tales of missing giant skeletons and the persistent allegations of evidence destruction, the issue of archaeological knowledge control becomes even more pronounced when we examine the fate of countless excavation reports that were meticulously compiled during the 19th and 20th centuries, many of which have quietly vanished from public archives. During the early days of modern archaeology, from the late 1800s to the 1930s, national archaeological societies and major museums in Britain, France, Germany, and the United States launched extensive expeditions across the Middle East, North Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Americas. These missions produced incredibly detailed reports, including intricate drawings, precise artifact descriptions, and thousands of photographs. At the time, many of these vital documents were publicly accessible or at least available to researchers through various academic libraries. And yet, strangely, by the mid-20th century, especially in the years following World War II, many of these reports began to disappear from circulation or were pulled from public catalogs under vague explanations like archive reorganization. One frequently cited example involves the British archaeological missions to Iraq between 1920 and 1935. These reports included detailed notes on layered architectural sites in Nineveh, Nimrud, and Kish, and described artifacts whose dating seemed to conflict with the accepted chronologies of the time. Even T. E. Lawrence, the famous Lawrence of Arabia, remarked in his letters that some tablets with puzzling inscriptions were quietly stored away, having been deemed too difficult to explain by the 1950s. Many of these specific reports no longer appeared in the British Museum's library catalog and have never been fully republished. A similar case involves the American Institute of Archaeology's reports on the Cahokia Mounds and Etowah Mounds, which were published between the 1890s and the 1900s. These documents described complex structures and artifacts that suggested a far more sophisticated indigenous civilization than the primitive tribal culture narrative of the time allowed. According to some researchers, by the 1930s, many of these original records were recalled for the correction of errors, yet the corrected versions were never released. Independent historians who attempted to access the originals were told that the files were either no longer extant or were temporarily unavailable. In France, The École Française d'Extrême-Orient had once archived thousands of glass negatives and field notes from early 20th century expeditions in Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos. Some of these records documented inscriptions, symbols, and dates that could have forced a major re-examination of the historical timeline of sites like Angkor Wat or Mysun. But by the 1970s, many of these archive boxes were sealed, with officials citing the ongoing Indochina Wars and the need for preservation. Nearly half a century later, only a small fraction of these materials has ever been declassified. As for the rest, no one seems to know where they are. These cases lead to a deeply unsettling question. Why do excavation reports, which are supposedly neutral academic documents, disappear so easily from public access? Is it possible that inconvenient data that contradicts well-established historical models has been quietly pulled from the record in order to preserve a theoretical consensus? Some scholars take a more cautious stance, blaming bureaucratic disarray and chronically underfunded archives. But for those who have personally requested access to these files, only to be met with the same scripted responses, politically sensitive, pending verification, or awaiting review, these explanations ring hollow. Behind those closed archive doors may lie nothing more than unremarkable field notes, or they may hold pieces of evidence powerful enough to challenge the mainstream narratives of the evolution of human civilization. And when access to primary data is controlled by a select few, the public is left with a sanitized version of history, clean, cohesive, and easy to digest. The disappearance of these reports never sparked a major public scandal. There's no lost gold, no monumental ruins to point to, only a profound silence and the growing void it leaves behind. But that silence invites a final, pressing question. How many times in modern history have original documents been withdrawn, not for preservation or correction, but simply to prevent a new generation from seeing a version of the truth that was deemed too inconvenient to accept? After these stories of vanishing archaeological records, our journey circles back to a place so iconic that it risks being overlooked through sheer overfamiliarity: the Giza Plateau in Egypt. For centuries, the three Great Pyramids have stood as towering and enigmatic symbols of ancient knowledge and immense power. They have drawn archaeologists, explorers, and tourists alike, each hoping to solve mysteries that have never quite been exhausted. But beneath the luminous limestone facade of the Great Pyramid of Khufu, or Cheops, lies another world, one that very few people have ever seen. This is a labyrinth of shafts, subterranean chambers, and deep vertical pits that are now largely inaccessible to the public. The largest of these, known as the subterranean chamber, sits directly beneath the base of the Great Pyramid, more than 30 meters below ground level. As early as the 19th century, pioneering explorers like Flinders Petrie and Giovanni Caviglia documented its layout in great detail. They described a rough-hewn, unfinished room, mysterious passageways that lead into darkness, and a deep, narrow shaft with no clear bottom. Petrie described it as a relic, possibly of ritualistic significance, or perhaps a part of the construction that was never completed. For decades, these underground spaces remained accessible to researchers and even a few daring explorers who managed to descend into the depths, capturing photographs and taking detailed measurements. But beginning in the late 1990s, Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities, under the leadership of the formidable Zahi Hawass, suddenly and severely restricted all access to these lower chambers. The official reason given was the need for structural safety and preservation. Yet, oddly, the upper passages of the pyramid remained open to any tourist who could buy a ticket at the gate. This selective closure immediately sparked suspicion. Independent researchers, including prominent figures like Graham Hancock and Andrew Collins, claimed that radar scans and ground-penetrating surveys had suggested the presence of larger, undiscovered voids beneath the subterranean chamber, possibly undocumented rooms or caches of ancient artifacts that had yet to be disclosed. They pointed to the preliminary findings from the Scan Pyramids project, which used advanced muography to peer deep inside the stone structure. The scans revealed several unexplained cavities, including a substantial void that was not accounted for in any previous architectural models of the pyramid. In response, Egypt's Ministry of Antiquities vehemently denied any cover-up, insisting that all research efforts were aimed solely at preservation and that no shocking discoveries had been made, contrary to the narratives being pushed by Western media. Still, the tightly controlled communication, the profound lack of transparency, and the repeated delays in granting excavation permits left many wondering if something deeper was being deliberately withheld. In ancient Egyptian belief, the pyramid was far more than just a tomb. It was a gateway between worlds, a cosmic bridge that connected the earth to the afterlife. Classical texts from the Hellenistic period refer to the underground chambers as the Hall of Trials, where the soul of the deceased had to face darkness before it could be reborn into the light. If these subterranean structures do indeed house evidence of early religious rites, or, even more tantalizingly, lost texts, it is not hard to see why their excavation and disclosure could become extremely sensitive matters, capable of reshaping humanity's entire understanding of ancient Egyptian theology. To this day, the only available images of the deepest chambers are grainy, black-and-white photographs from a bygone era or clandestine snapshots taken by explorers before the restrictions were tightened. Official explanations continue to revolve around the familiar and unhelpful phrase, "Further research is needed." And yet, it is precisely this silence, this vacuum of information, that suggests the truth has already been pre-filtered, released only in carefully selected fragments at times deemed appropriate by the authorities. Standing on the sunlit Giza Plateau, surrounded by crowds of tourists taking selfies, it is easy to forget that just beneath your feet may lie chambers that no one has ever fully explored or been allowed to. And the question lingers, what really rests deep within the stone? A sacred archive? A ceremonial room? Or simply an empty, unfinished space? But more importantly, why, for decades, has the decision to open or close that space belonged to so few, while the rest of the world is left only to guess? After the tale of sealed chambers beneath the Great Pyramid of Giza, we shift our gaze to the opposite side of the world, to the legendary and mystical waters of Lake Titicaca, the natural border between Bolivia and Peru and the mythic cradle of Andean civilization. Situated over 3,800 meters above sea level, Lake Titicaca is not only the largest freshwater lake in South America, but also the sacred site where, according to Inca mythology, the children of the sun god first emerged to found their great empire. The Spanish conquistadors heard whispers from the locals of sunken stone cities and hidden treasures concealed beneath the waves. But it wasn't until the late 20th century that modern technology finally began to put that ancient legend to the test. In the year 2000, an ambitious international archaeological project, sponsored by the Bolivian government, the Andean Archaeological Research Institute, and several European organizations, conducted a series of deep-water sonar scans and diving expeditions in the lake. In their preliminary reports, the team confirmed the existence of a massive submerged architectural complex, spanning thousands of square meters. They discovered stone walls laid out in geometric patterns, step foundations, monolithic columns, and a wide variety of ceramic artifacts, including figurines and ritual objects. The announcement sent ripples of excitement through the South American research community. Many archaeologists speculated that the site could represent a major pre-Inca ceremonial center, perhaps linked to the Tiwanaku civilization, which thrived from the 5th to the 12th century CE. But some of the details, such as the style of the stonework and the iconography on the artifacts, didn't quite match the known Tiwanaku patterns. A few cautious scholars began to ask a bold and provocative question. Could these ruins predate Tiwanaku altogether, hinting at an even older, forgotten civilization? And then, everything came to a grinding halt. Just as the findings were gaining significant international attention and academic journals were preparing to publish in-depth analyses of the discovery, the project was abruptly suspended. All further excavation and research were paused, with the official reasons cited being a lack of funding and cultural sensitivity requests from researchers, including some who had been involved in the initial phase of the project, to access the recovered artifacts were denied. Several of the European sponsors withdrew their funding entirely, and the project's documents and data were effectively sealed indefinitely. Independent archaeologists were baffled by this turn of events. They noted that the original funding had been secured years in advance, and that continuing the excavation would have required relatively modest resources. Furthermore, the local communities around Lake Titicaca, rather than opposing the research, had shown immense pride and a willingness to collaborate, casting serious doubt on the claim of cultural sensitivity as a genuine barrier. Some began to suspect a different motive. Could the findings under the lake contain information that was disruptive enough to challenge the mainstream narratives of Andean civilization? Or perhaps they threatened to stir up unmanageable debates about ancient timelines or even the possibility of transoceanic cultural connections. A more conservative theory points to internal conflicts between the scholars and their sponsors. But even this doesn't explain one central and undeniable fact. In over 20 years, no full sonar maps, no detailed artifact inventories, and no carbon dating result from the site have ever been made public. Only a handful of images and a few scattered press releases remain, just enough to confirm the site's impressive scale, but not enough to determine its nature or its chronology. Today, tourists cruise across the shimmering blue waters of Lake Titicaca, completely unaware that just beneath those waves may rest an entire chapter of human history that has never been told in full. The stone walls sleep in the silent depths, and the records about them lie hidden away in locked drawers, with no indication of when, or if, they will ever be opened again. The question is no longer just who built those submerged structures, but what caused a widely announced and promising excavation to completely vanish from public view. And more profoundly, how many fragments of our ancient memory have been discovered, only to be sealed away by a bureaucratic decision before they could ever take their rightful place in human history? From the sunken stone walls of Lake Titicaca, our journey now takes us across the world to the remote and desolate Bayan Har mountain range, which straddles the border between Tibet and China. This is one of the most isolated and treacherous regions in all of Asia. It was here in the late 1930s that a highly controversial archaeological story began, one that would come to be known for its strange and enigmatic artifacts, its sudden and complete official silence, and its persistent, lingering mystery. This is the story of the Dropa stones. According to scattered Western reports that began to emerge in the 1960s, the original expedition was led by a Chinese archaeologist named Chi Pu-ti, who had set out to study a system of high-altitude limestone caves situated over 3,000 meters above sea level. Within these caves, the team allegedly discovered a series of small, orderly tombs containing unusually shaped skeletons with elongated skulls and short, frail bodies. But what truly shocked the team was the presence of over 700 circular stone discs, each about 30 centimeters in diameter and less than 2 centimeters thick. Each disc had a hole in its center and was covered in finely etched spiral grooves that were filled with tiny, unknown symbols. In 1962, a man named Professor Samamnui, who was said to be affiliated with the Beijing Academy of Ancient Studies, reportedly began the arduous task of deciphering these symbols. He claimed that the spirals were not merely decorative, but were in fact a form of ancient hieroglyphics. His translations allegedly told the incredible story of beings who had come from the sky, crash-landed in the mountains thousands of years ago, and were eventually forced to survive among the native people of the region. Their tale included details of conflict, eventual reconciliation, and even interbreeding between the two groups. If true, the Dropa stones would constitute one of the oldest recorded accounts of extraterrestrial contact in human history, a claim that stunned both believers and skeptics alike. But then, something very strange happened. Shortly after this information was supposedly translated and leaked to the West, Professor Samamnui's research completely vanished. His name was nowhere to be found in any official Chinese academic directories. The Beijing Academy denied any knowledge of such a project. No peer-reviewed journals ever published his findings. And over time, the very existence of the Dropa expedition itself was called into question. Western scholars who tried to follow the trail consistently hit dead ends. There were no official records, no institutional response, just a long, deep, and unbroken silence. From that point on, the Dropa stones became a symbol of the twilight zone that exists between truth and fiction. Skeptics dismissed the entire story as an elaborate hoax, pointing to the unverifiable sources and the complete absence of any solid documentation. But independent researchers countered with a compelling point. No one has ever definitively proven the story to be false, either. There has never been a public, official denial from the Chinese government, only a complete and collective silence. Some accounts claim that a few of the Dropa stones were briefly put on display at the Xi'an Museum before being removed. Today, however, no publicly verified specimens of these stones remain in any museum or archive. What makes the story harder to dismiss entirely is that the technical descriptions of the Dropa stones are consistent with ancient Tibetan traditions of inscribing symbolic texts on his circular stone discs. Some ethnographers have argued that the tale may represent a fusion of real archaeology and local mythology, referencing long-held legends of star-born tribes who descended from the heavens. But even if that is the case, no one has ever been able to explain why hundreds of finely crafted stone discs, if they were real, would leave behind no photographs, no detailed studies, and no institutional paper trail. Critics have called it one of the greatest hoaxes of the 20th century. But for many on the archaeological fringe, it is the very absence of denial, the complete vanishing of all records, and a uniform silence from Chinese institutions that continue to raise eyebrows. The Dropa stones remain trapped in a paradoxical space, impossible to confirm, yet suspiciously difficult to disprove. Today, few people passing through the desolate Bayan Har Mountains know that this quiet, windswept range was once the epicenter of an enduring debate about the boundaries between archaeology and myth. And like so many stories that have come before, it is not certainty that sustains the legend, but a carefully coordinated and absolute silence. And so, the question still hangs in the thin mountain air. If the Dropa stones were merely a fabrication, why has no one ever officially refuted the story? But if they were real, what was discovered on those discs that caused such a total and complete blackout, as if the entire event had never happened at all? From the vanishing Dropa stones in the high mountains of Bayan Har, the trail now leads us to a concept that is as fascinating as it is controversial. Part, short for out-of-place artifact coined by the zoologist Ivan T. Sanderson in the mid-20th century, the term refers to ancient objects whose age, technology, or context appear to be glaringly inconsistent with the civilization that supposedly produced them. What makes parts such a sensitive and contentious topic is not just their potential to challenge our established historical timelines. It's the peculiar way in which they are often handled by mainstream institutions. Many large and respected museums have briefly acknowledged, and in some cases even temporarily displayed, these anomalous items, only to quietly withdraw them later, labeling them as unverified artifacts, or storing them indefinitely in off-limits archives. One of the most famous examples of an part is the Antikythera mechanism, a complex bronze device that was recovered in 1901 from a sunken Roman-era ship off the coast of Greece. Its incredibly intricate system of interlocking gears baffled scholars for decades. It was only much later that advanced imaging technologies confirmed that it was, in fact, an ancient astronomical calculator with a level of precision comparable to an 18th-century mechanical clock. Today, it is proudly displayed at the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, but for nearly half a century after its discovery, the device was kept in storage, largely dismissed as being too advanced for the known technological capabilities of ancient Greece. Another frequently cited case is the Baghdad battery, a small ceramic jar containing a copper cylinder and signs of acidic residue, which was discovered near Ctesiphon, Iraq, in 1936. Some researchers have proposed that it functioned as a primitive electrochemical cell, possibly used for gold plating. Because this idea did not align with the existing views of Parthian-era technology, the artifact sat largely ignored in the Baghdad Museum for decades, only drawing significant attention after a Western publication featured a photograph of it. And there are countless other examples. The Klerksdorp spheres of South Africa, with their seemingly perfect grooves etched into metallic nodules, the London hammer, found embedded in a sandstone formation, and pre-Columbian carvings that appear to depict flying machines. All of these objects seem to follow a familiar trajectory, a sudden burst of media buzz, followed by their withdrawal from public exhibition, their reclassification under the heading of uncertain provenance, or their quiet transfer into private collections. Skeptical archaeologists argue that most OOP arts are either misunderstood or overhyped. They're often misdated objects, later intrusions into older geological strata, or, in some cases, modern forgeries. But the real paradox lies in this. Instead of publicly studying and transparently debunking these items, institutions often choose silence. They remove them from their catalogs, close the files, or simply refuse to discuss them. It is this very silence that feeds the larger suspicions that human technological history may be far more complex and nonlinear than our current academic models allow. Today, as visitors stroll through the pristine and well-lit halls of prestigious museums, few realize that just beneath their feet, or deep within heavily secured storage facilities, hundreds of such inconvenient artifacts might lie untouched. They are not considered authenticated enough to be displayed, yet they are not destroyed or discarded. They exist in a strange limbo of institutional denial. The story of OOP arts is not necessarily an accusation of a grand conspiracy. It may simply be the byproduct of institutional discomfort, the fear of destabilizing a knowledge system that has been considered settled for far too long. Because if a gear mechanism that is 2,000 years ahead of its time, or a ceramic battery from antiquity, were to be definitively proven authentic, it would force us to rewrite our textbooks and fundamentally rethink the very nature of civilization as we know it. And perhaps that is precisely why these artifacts remain on the margins, reduced to grainy black and white photos, obscure publications, and a long list of unanswered questions. From the out-of-place artifacts quietly gathering dust in museum basements, our story now drifts into the East China Sea, where a submerged stone formation once ignited a decades-long debate. This is the story of Yonaguni, a sunken monument or merely a natural phenomenon. Located off the coast of Japan's westernmost island, just 110 kilometers from Taiwan, Yonaguni became the focus of global attention in 1986 when a local diver named Kahataro Aratake stumbled upon a massive rock formation resting about 25 meters beneath the waves. The early photographs he took astonished the scientific community. The stone blocks appeared to form near-perfect terraces with sharp, 90-degree angles, polished flat surfaces, and grooves that closely resembled man-made channels or corridors. Following this discovery, a research team led by Professor Masaaki Kimura of the University of the Ryukyus began a detailed process of underwater mapping and documentation. In his early reports, Kimura described the Yonaguni Formation as an enormous architectural complex, including what appeared to be a pyramid-like structure, entry gates, ceremonial stairs, narrow ritual paths, and even faint relief carvings on some of the walls. He cautiously proposed that the formation could be the ruins of a man-made structure that was submerged at the end of the last ice age, possibly over 10,000 years ago. If true, this would fundamentally challenge the long-standing views about the history of Japan and East Asia, suggesting the existence of a prehistoric civilization that was capable of large-scale stone engineering long before the advent of recorded history. But as media coverage of the discovery surged, the response from Japanese archaeological and geological institutions grew increasingly cautious. Japan's Geological Society issued an official rebuttal, stating that the Yonaguni Formation was simply the result of naturally eroded sandstone. Even more curiously, Professor Kimura's own team, The very group that had published the initial findings began to withdraw from the international media spotlight. By the early 2000s, funding for interdisciplinary research at the site had completely dried up, and the team's full survey data was no longer being publicly updated. All efforts to continue the research were quietly shelved. Independent researchers, including Graham Hancock and a documentary crew from Channel 4, attempted to investigate Yonaguni for themselves. They reported that key information, including sonar imaging, 3D scans, and detailed measurement data, had become incredibly difficult to obtain. Requests for new funding were met with a wall of silence, as mainstream Japanese academics began to distance themselves. Wary of being associated with what was quickly being dubbed the Eastern Atlantis, skeptics continue to argue that Yonaguni is nothing more than a rare geological anomaly, a place where natural fractures and erosion have happened to create forms that resemble architecture. But others quietly asked a persistent question. If it is only a natural formation, why has so much of the original survey data disappeared? Why aren't the detailed sonar scans and 3D maps being published in peer-reviewed journals for open and transparent scrutiny? Today, if you visit the island of Yonaguni, you can still hire local divers to explore the underwater terraces. You can run your hands along the flat, smooth stone surfaces and trace the sharply angled corners beneath the turquoise waves. But you will be hard-pressed to find a complete official report that contains side-by-side geological and archaeological evaluations of the site. The story of Yonaguni doesn't just ask what humans might have once built beneath the sea. It raises an all-too-familiar question. Why was a major and potentially game-changing discovery first celebrated and then quietly buried in a sea of silence? Is it a deep-seated fear of disrupting historical orthodoxy? Or is it perhaps just an excess of academic caution in the face of a hypothesis that is simply too bold to be accepted? And, most of all, will Yonaguni remain a monument drowned by waves and silence? Or will someone, someday, be patient enough to uncover its final, undeniable truth? If Yonaguni raised serious doubts about how old certain ancient ruins might truly be, the story of medieval architecture in Europe touches on something even more delicate. Has someone, at some point in the past, deliberately revised the dates of ancient structures in order to make history appear more linear, more manageable, and less controversial? Since the 19th century, as historians and architects began to systematically catalog the vast number of medieval churches, castles, and fortresses across Europe, they relied on two primary sources of data: ecclesiastical and royal records, and detailed architectural analysis. But over time, small but persistent inconsistencies began to emerge. In England, France, and Germany, several major sites were found to contain foundation stones, hidden tunnels, or entire wall segments that were built using techniques distinctly different from the rest of the structure, some of them resembling Roman construction methods, or even older styles. Prominent Gothic cathedrals like Chartres, Reims, and Strasbourg are key examples of this phenomenon. During the extensive 19th century restorations of these buildings, renowned architects like Viollet-le-Duc noted the presence of foundations that contained Roman-style bricks and carvings. But these crucial notes were often left vague and were never incorporated into the official dating of the structures. Why? Because most of these restoration projects were tightly supervised by the church and by historical commissions, both of which were heavily invested in preserving the image of Christian medieval Europe as the clear and unambiguous starting point of all grand architecture. In England, similar debates arose over structures like Dover Castle and the Tower of London. Subterranean chambers in these iconic buildings showed mortar and stonework that closely resembled late Roman methods. Early 20th century archaeologists like Frederick Bligh publicly questioned whether many so-called Norman or Plantagenet structures were actually built on top of much older foundations, with their timelines deliberately altered to legitimize the rule of newer dynasties. Such questions were often dismissed as unserious and were consistently left out of mainstream academic journals. In Germany, the magnificent Marksburg Castle, a powerful symbol of medieval military architecture, has long been officially dated to the 13th century. Yet, a 1972 survey that used radiocarbon dating on samples of mortar and carbonized stone yielded results that were several centuries older. The researchers who conducted the study were visibly uncomfortable with their own findings. The results were ultimately labeled as non-representative, and the official 13th century dating of the castle remained unchanged. Some argue that there is a simpler explanation for all of this: cultural layering. In the Middle Ages, builders often repurposed older Roman forts or Carolingian ramparts, expanding or adapting them, and then branding them as new constructions. But in many cases, these reused materials and older layers were deliberately ignored or simply rolled into the date of the newer construction, creating the illusion of a seamless, monolithic history. For many historians, this raises an uncomfortable question: how much of medieval Europe's architectural heritage is truly original, and how much is simply a rebranded legacy from a deeper, forgotten past? The truth is even harder to uncover when we find that the 19th and 20th century restoration records for these buildings are often missing pages, have been clearly altered, or are left frustratingly incomplete. In France, for example, some of the original notes from the foundation surveys at Chartres Cathedral were lost during World War II, and no full copies of them survive. Skeptics say that this erasure and soft editing of building dates is not a grand conspiracy, but is simply a matter of narrative convenience, a desire to craft a simplified history that is easier to teach, to memorialize, and to link to national pride or church authority. After all, a neat and tidy timeline is far easier to digest than the chaotic and messy overlap of migrations that followed the collapse of Rome. But in that convenient simplicity, a gray zone of memory has emerged, a place where bricks that are 1,000 years older than the wall above them are still officially labeled as 12th century just to fit the plaque on the wall. And when independent researchers suggest that some of these structures may predate their official labels by a full millennium, the only response they often get is a profound and deafening silence. Today, as we walk beneath the magnificent stone arches of medieval castles and Gothic cathedrals, few of us ever stop to ask, when was this wall truly built? How many times has it been torn down, rebuilt, and renamed just to serve a cleaner historical narrative? And more importantly, are we ready to confront a more tangled and less convenient truth if the original records were ever to be fully released? From the ancient stone walls of Europe, where historical timelines may have been quietly adjusted to fit cleaner narratives, we now return eastward to a culture famed for its meticulous record-keeping: Imperial China, and in particular, the Song dynasty, which ruled from the 10th to the 13th centuries. The Song left behind some of the most extensive and detailed historical archives in all of East Asia, including official dynastic histories and comprehensive chronicles of daily events. But buried deep within these voluminous texts are subtle signs of revision, suggesting that even the most detailed histories may have been strategically edited to serve a political purpose. During the Song era, from the reign of Taizu to Ningzong, court historians were tasked with the responsibility of recording daily events, imperial edicts, military campaigns, natural disasters, and politically sensitive court cases. Monumental works like the History of Song, Song Sure the extended continuation to the comprehensive mirror, Shu Ziji Tongjian Changbian and the Song Huiyao became the definitive historical references for generations of scholars. What is less commonly discussed is the fact that these texts were subjected to at least 2 major rounds of editorial revision, each under the tight and direct control of the emperor or the state cabinet. According to modern scholarship, the first wave of editing began as soon as Emperor Taizu consolidated his power after the chaotic 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period. In order to justify the Song's legitimacy and its claim to the mandate of heaven, many earlier events were deliberately reinterpreted. Commanders who had resisted the rise of the dynasty were recast as treacherous rebels, and the Song court was consistently portrayed as the singular, benevolent force that was restoring order to a fractured China. In some of the early Northern Song records, original passages were either significantly shortened or completely rewritten with a more accusatory and politically charged tone. The second major revision occurred under the subsequent Yuan dynasty, which conquered the song. A committee of court historians was formed to produce the official history of song, the version that is still the most widely cited today. It is a voluminous and incredibly detailed work, but 20th century Chinese scholars like Chun Mu and Qin Inca noted numerous oddities within its pages. Key historical figures seem to vanish inexplicably from the timeline, and major political trials either disappear completely or are reduced to a single, vague sentence. One notable case is that of the official Lu Wendi, who had been involved in significant political reform under Emperor Huizong. According to contemporary accounts, he was wrongly accused of corruption but was later fully exonerated and reinstated to his position. Yet, in the final official history of Song, that rehabilitation never appears, leaving only the tarnished image of a disgraced official. Why was this crucial detail omitted? Perhaps it was because the new Yuan regime had no interest in honoring reformers who were aligned with the ideals of the fallen Song dynasty. Another example is found in the records of the secret diplomatic negotiations that took place between the Southern Song and the Jin dynasty. Original correspondence from these negotiations had once been cited in contemporary court records, but in the final Song Shi, those documents vanish, replaced only by second-hand, summarized accounts. Though no official reason was ever given for this change, many historians suspect that the Yuan editors sought to suppress any reminders of Southern Song concessions, which could have potentially sparked unrest in the newly conquered territories. What is striking is that many modern academics still accept the Song Shi as an authoritative historical source, citing its coherence and its systematic organization. But that very cohesion is what raises red flags for some critical scholars. When a fallen dynasty's history is written by its conquerors, where is the line between recording the truth and rewriting it to serve the legitimacy of a new power? Even today, much of the Song Chronicle remains uncross-checked against the scattered evidence found in local archives, family diaries, and stone inscriptions. Independent historians continue to try to piece together these fragments, but their work is often dismissed as unverified or too troublesome to pursue, and perhaps the most sobering thought is this. If a powerful and sophisticated dynasty like the Song could edit its own trial records, erase diplomatic negotiations, and leave behind a version of history that has been reprinted for centuries, can we ever be certain that these records reflect the one true version of events? Or are they, in fact, a carefully crafted story, designed to smooth over contradictions and to keep the public from ever asking what lies beneath the polished surface? If the Song Dynasty Chronicles showed how victors can successfully reshape the past, then ancient Egypt offers a different, yet equally compelling tale. One of a powerful and revolutionary ruler who was deliberately and systematically erased by his own people. To this day, many of the original documents about him remain sealed away in archives, their full contents still unknown to the world. Over 3,000 years ago, Pharaoh Akhenaten rose to power and launched the most radical religious reform in all of Egyptian history. He proclaimed the Aten, the solar disk, as the one and only true God, directly challenging the centuries-long dominance of the traditional priesthood devoted to Ammonius, which had been deeply entrenched in power for generations. Akhenaten ordered the construction of a brand-new capital city, Akhetaten, modern-day Amarna, and issued a series of sweeping decrees that fundamentally transformed Egyptian rituals, art, and even the practice of historical record-keeping. After his death, Egypt's subsequent rulers moved swiftly and ruthlessly to perform a damnatio memoriae, a formal and complete erasure of his memory. His name was meticulously chiseled out of temple walls, his statues were systematically destroyed or buried, and in later dynastic records, he was mentioned only vaguely as the criminal or the enemy of the gods. Yet despite this comprehensive campaign of destruction, many of the original records from his reign, including official letters, royal decrees, and internal administrative reports were not destroyed. Instead, they were sealed away in temple archives, storage rooms, and private tombs that have yet to be fully excavated. In the 19th century, European archaeological teams began digging at the site of Amarna and uncovered thousands of clay tablets and inscribed fragments, which are now known as the Amarna letters. Some of these were published, revealing a fragile and complex picture of an Egypt that was struggling to control its vast territories while its royal court was consumed with radical religious reform. But the vast majority of these materials, including detailed lists of tribute, the names of foreign correspondents, and a multitude of internal memos, remain unpublished. They are currently stored within the archives of institutions like the Cairo Museum, the British Museum, and various private collections scattered across Europe. Modern scholars such as Nicholas Reeves and Aidan Dotson have asked a simple but profoundly important question. Why, after more than a century, have so few of these primary records from the Amarna period been fully released to the public? The common explanations offered include a lack of qualified translators, the need to prioritize preservation, or simple academic sensitivity. But others suspect a deeper motive, that if the full Amarna archive were ever to be unveiled, Akhenaten's legacy might prove to be far more complex than the simplistic label of heretical tyrant would suggest. He may not have been merely a religious fanatic, but a shrewd political reformer who directly threatened the immense wealth and control of the elite priesthood, a threat that subsequent dynasties had absolutely no interest in remembering. Another mysterious thread deepens the story. Among the unreleased tablets, some are rumored to detail the complex succession that followed Akhenaten's death, including the precise nature of the relationship between Tutankhamun and the powerful Queen Nefertiti, proving or disproving whether Nefertiti ruled as a pharaoh in her own right after Akhenaten, or whether Tutankhamun was his biological son, would not just alter academic timelines. It could also have significant implications for modern claims of heritage and even for the political status of the institutions that manage Egypt's priceless antiquities today. In modern Egypt, access to the Amarna archives remains severely restricted. Only a handful of selected researchers are ever granted access, and excavation permits for related sites often take years to obtain, if they are granted at all. Among archaeologists, a half-joking phrase often circulates. Amarna is always open, she just never invites you in. Today, as tourists crowd around the magnificent golden mask of Tutankhamun, few realize that just a few hundred meters away, wooden crates containing the true story of his father have sat untouched, collecting dust for centuries. And the quieter, more profound question is this. If one day the Amarna tablets are fully translated and released, how many chapters of Egyptian history, long assumed to be true, will have to be completely rewritten from scratch? If the sealed Amarna archives demonstrate how power can effectively erase a king from memory, then medieval Europe reveals a different kind of story, one in which the church became the ultimate and absolute gatekeeper of knowledge, deciding what was allowed to be passed on to future generations and what was destined to vanish forever from collective memory. From the 4th century onward, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, the church rapidly constructed a formidable system of intellectual control. This system extended far beyond the realm of theology, asserting its influence over history, the natural sciences, philosophy, and medicine. By the Middle Ages, the cathedral schools, and, later, the first European universities became the exclusive centers for training the continent's entire educated class. This system did, in fact, preserve great legacies, including the Latin language, classical legal traditions, and countless ancient manuscripts, but also created an unprecedented and powerful filter on ideas. Any text that was deemed incompatible with official doctrine or that was seen as likely to disrupt theological authority was subject to revision, suppression, or, in many cases, outright destruction. A prime example of this is the case of Origen, a brilliant 3rd century Christian theologian who wrote hundreds of insightful commentaries on Scripture. Among his more radical ideas were beliefs in the pre-existence of the soul, the concept of universal salvation, and even the possibility that evil itself would eventually be redeemed and reconciled with God. By the 6th century, the Second Council of Constantinople formally condemned Origen as a heretic. His writings were then systematically purged, with only fragmented citations surviving in the secluded libraries of cloistered monasteries. Another case is that of Greek medical knowledge. The texts of Hippocrates and Galen were initially preserved by the Church, but as new translations, especially from Arabic sources, began to emerge, the Church demanded rigorous censorship. Passages that contradicted the idea of the soul governing the body, or that proposed a disease might arise from natural rather than divine causes, were often excised or suppressed. By the 13th century, this intellectual control reached its peak when Pope Innocent III issued decrees that required all universities to follow officially approved curricula. Any unapproved Aristotelian texts, especially those dealing with natural philosophy, were strictly banned. In 1210, the Council of Paris declared, "No one shall teach or listen to the natural philosophy of Aristotle, either in public or in private." Although these restrictions were gradually loosened over time, they left a deep and lasting mark on Western thought. Knowledge, it was understood, had to be approved by divine authority. Even as great institutions of learning like Bologna, Oxford, and Paris gained prominence, they remained under strict ecclesiastical oversight. Chancellors were appointed with the approval of bishops, and all course content required the sanction of the Church. Thinkers who dared to push the boundaries, like Roger Bacon, who explored the fields of optics and chemistry, were closely monitored and, in some cases, placed under house arrest. A more formal mechanism of control was introduced in 1559, the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, or the list of prohibited books, which lasted for nearly 4 centuries. This index banned any work that was deemed a threat to doctrinal orthodoxy. Among those who were blacklisted were Copernicus, Galileo, Giordano Bruno, and Spinoza. In its harshest periods, the mere possession of one of these books could lead to the confiscation of property or even execution. To be fair, the Church also played a crucial role in preserving enormous amounts of classical knowledge. Monastic scriptoria painstakingly copied thousands of ancient texts, without which Europe may have lost its Greco-Roman legacy entirely. But the essential question remains, did this monopoly on knowledge also ensure that only sanitized and controlled versions of that legacy were passed on? Today, when we leaf through thousand-year-old manuscripts in the Vatican Library, it is nearly impossible to tell which texts are originals and which are the products of subtle and careful revision. For centuries, the Church held the power to define truth, to decide what qualified as orthodox knowledge and what was to be condemned as heresy. And perhaps the most sobering question of all is this: if every story had to pass through the Church's gate before it could reach the light of day, are we truly reading history? Or are we just reading the version of history that someone believed we were allowed to know? If the Church's tight control over educational content carefully shaped the intellectual landscape of medieval Europe, then the Vatican's secret archives, now formally known as the Vatican Apostolic Archive, represent the absolute pinnacle of silent authority. This is a vast and labyrinthine vault containing centuries of history, secret correspondence, and official records, all sealed behind doors that very few people are ever allowed to open. Located adjacent to the Vatican Library, the archive spans nearly 90 kilometers, or 55 miles, of shelving, a number that would astonish any historian. Its contents are staggering: diplomatic correspondence, transcripts from the Inquisition, papal decrees, detailed court diaries, internal memos, and countless letters exchanged between European monarchs and popes, dating from the 8th century all the way to the present day. It sounds like a magnificent treasure trove of knowledge, open to any earnest scholar who wishes to explore it. But in reality, for many centuries, this archive was entirely off-limits to the outside world. The term secretum in Latin does not necessarily mean secret in the modern sense. It originally meant private or personal. Technically, many of the documents are simply the internal records of the Holy See, not classified state secrets. But the long-standing tradition of restricted access and the consistent refusal to publish these materials widely have turned the archive into a living legend, a sealed chronicle of hidden histories, some of which may never see the light of day. It was only in 1881 that Pope Leo XIII began to allow limited access to scholars. But even now, the process remains incredibly strict and highly controlled. Each year, only a small handful of researchers are granted access. Applicants must submit detailed academic credentials, letters of recommendation from established institutions, and they must specify exactly which documents they wish to consult. Browsing is absolutely not allowed. Photocopying entire documents is strictly forbidden. Researchers may request only a limited number of documents per day, and all of their handwritten notes must be reviewed by an archivist before they are allowed to leave the reading room. Those who have been granted entry describe the experience as almost ritualistic. They speak of high-security gates, long corridors bathed in a soft, amber light, and heavy iron doors that lead into eerily quiet rooms. Wooden cabinets, centuries old, line the hallways, containing handwritten indexes that are older than many modern nations. If a researcher steps outside their assigned area, their access privileges can be revoked immediately. Within those countless shelves lie documents that are rumored to contain information powerful enough to completely reshape our historical understanding. These include the full trial transcripts of Galileo Galilei, which may reveal not just a clash between science and faith, but deeper and more complex political tensions. There is also the Templar dossier, the complete records of the secretive trials that led to the dismantling of the Knights Templar in the 14th century. There are confidential letters from monarchs to popes, containing details of negotiations and schemes that have never been told in any textbook. And there is the complete documentation related to the Treaty of Tordesillas, which carved up the new world between Spain and Portugal, effectively legalizing centuries of colonization. In 2003, the Vatican allowed a partial release of the Templar records, specifically the interrogation of Jacques de Molay, perhaps in an attempt to quell some of the wilder speculation. But ironically, this carefully controlled disclosure only served to intensify public curiosity. If there is truly nothing to hide, why do nearly 90 kilometers of shelves remain off-limits to all but a select few? Supporters of the Vatican's policy of secrecy argue that these strict protocols are necessary to prevent the loss, misinterpretation, or commercialization of sensitive historical documents. But critics continue to ask, when the largest archive in Christendom opens its doors only a narrow slit, who gets to control the rewriting of history? And, more urgently, could our entire understanding of the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and Enlightenment be shaped more by what has been withheld than by what has been revealed? Today, the Vatican's secret archives remain a mythic and impenetrable labyrinth of memory, where letters written centuries ago sit in profound silence, waiting, or perhaps never waiting at all. And the final, haunting question still hangs in the air. If the entirety of those archives were ever to be unveiled, what parts of human history would we be forced to rewrite? If the Vatican's secret archives symbolize the power to hide knowledge behind locked doors, then the Society of Jesus, more commonly known as the Jesuits, represent a more subtle and perhaps more pervasive form of power, the ability to shape what knowledge is taught and how it is interpreted from the very beginning. Founded in 1540 during the height of the Counter-Reformation, the Jesuits emerged as a powerful response to the growing influence of Lutheranism, Calvinism, and the new currents of thought that were shaking the authority of the Vatican to its core. Ignatius of Loyola, the order's founder, quickly recognized that the Church could not rely solely on papal decrees or inquisitorial courts to reclaim its influence. What was needed, he believed, was a long-term strategy to infiltrate the very roots of knowledge. The schools, the universities, and the intellectual centers where future elites, scholars, and leaders were being formed. Within just a few decades, the Jesuits had established hundreds of colleges across Europe and its colonies, from Paris and Rome to Goa, Mexico City, and Lima. By the 17th century, A Jesuit education had become the dominant and most prestigious path for Catholic elites. These institutions taught more than just theology. They offered rigorous instruction in classical literature, mathematics, philosophy, and the natural sciences. What made the Jesuits so unique was their remarkable ability to combine an outward appearance of intellectual tolerance with a strict internal discipline. In their classrooms, students could discuss Aristotle, Euclid, or even Copernicus, but only within a carefully constructed framework that always upheld the ultimate authority of theology. Science and philosophy were welcomed, but only as long as they did not challenge the supremacy of God or the salvific role of the Church. One well-known example of this is the Jesuits' handling of modern astronomy. When Copernicus published his heliocentric model of the solar system in 1543, Jesuit schools initially taught it as a useful mathematical hypothesis. But by the 17th century, as Galileo began to assert that the heliocentric model was a physical reality, the Jesuits swiftly revised their curriculum. Heliocentrism could still be mentioned, but only as a computational tool, not as a statement of fact. Assertions that the Earth actually moved around the Sun were removed from all official instruction. Likewise, in the field of philosophy, the Jesuits maintained firm control through the Ratio Studiorum, their official guide to education, which was published in 1599. This incredibly detailed document listed which texts could be taught, which specific passages must be omitted, and how to interpret them in ways that would not provoke religious doubt. Thinkers like Descartes and Francis Bacon could be quoted, but only insofar as their ideas were framed as being servants of the faith. On the one hand, the Jesuits played a vital role in preserving classical knowledge that might have otherwise been lost amidst the religious and political turmoil of the time. They helped to spread knowledge of science, linguistics, and archaeology, especially in Asia and Latin America. But on the other hand, many historians have questioned whether their strict and pervasive intellectual oversight has shaped the Western understanding of history and philosophy in ways that have ensured it would never seriously undermine ecclesiastical power. The effects of this powerful educational strategy endured for centuries. Many of Europe's most influential administrators, from the vast Spanish and Portuguese bureaucracies to the French aristocracy, were trained in Jesuit colleges. They emerged from these institutions with a pre-shaped worldview. Science and knowledge were valuable, but only when they were kept safely beneath a metaphysical ceiling that was firmly enforced by the Church. Even after the temporary suppression of the Jesuit order in 1773, which was brought about by pressure from secular monarchies, their educational legacy survived. The Ratio Studiorum continued to influence university curricula, and the idea of a soft ideological supervision remained deeply embedded in the structure of many European universities. Today, the Jesuits are often admired for their discipline and their high academic rigor, seen as keepers of intellectual standards in times of crisis. But quietly, many scholars still wonder, when an institution is at once a missionary, a censor, and a teacher, can objective knowledge ever be truly free of intent? And like the Vatican archives, the silent but powerful presence of the Jesuit curricula reminds us that the most dangerous kind of knowledge suppression may not be what is forbidden outright, but what is allowed to exist only within the boundaries drawn by those who rule the narrative. After centuries of curricula being carefully shaped by the Church and other religious institutions, the Age of Enlightenment seemed to usher in a new era, one where reason and science reclaimed the authority to define reality. But even in our modern world, where geometry is taught as a purely mathematical discipline, a quiet but persistent question remains. Have the deeper, symbolic meanings of ancient geometric forms been deliberately reduced, or even erased, until only their technical shells remain? The concept of sacred geometry exists in nearly every ancient civilization. The Egyptians built their pyramids according to the principles of the Golden Ratio. The Greeks designed the Parthenon with precise harmonic proportions. Indian mandalas were meticulously mapped out based on principles of energetic and symbolic geometry. In these esoteric traditions, circles, spirals, six-pointed stars, and lotus patterns were not just simple construction tools. They were powerful metaphors for cosmic order, visual expressions of the profound link between the spiritual and material realms. But as modern science advanced, especially during the 19th century, geometry became increasingly severed from its philosophical and spiritual context. In today's school textbooks, geometry has been distilled down into a set of rigid and lifeless definitions: points, lines, angles, polygons. Powerful symbols like the flower of life, Metatron's cube, or the divine ratio have been relegated to the margins of mysticism or conspiracy theory, with no recognized place in standard academic curricula. Researchers such as Keith Critchlow and Robert Lawler have argued that this separation was not just an academic development. It was an intentional process, a deliberate desacralization of knowledge that aimed to strip these symbols of their storytelling power and reduce them to nothing more than soulless math problems. In an era of extreme rationalism, anyone who dares to reference the symbolic dimensions of form is easily dismissed as being unscientific. Consider the flower of life, a symbol that is found etched into the ancient temple walls at Abydos in Egypt, on Renaissance-era tombstones, and in intricate Islamic mosaics. Many 19th and 20th century scholars acknowledged its universal significance. But as the idea of a cosmic geometric web became increasingly inconvenient to the dominant materialist narratives, textbooks slowly began to phase out any metaphysical interpretation of the symbol. Or take the pentagram, a five-pointed star. To the ancient Pythagoreans, it symbolized harmony, health, and the microcosm, the human being in perfect relation to the universe. In the Middle Ages, it became associated with magic and was subsequently denounced by the Church. By modern times, out of fear of potential religious backlash, Western textbooks refer to it only as a five-pointed star that could be used to teach about angles and symmetry, while completely ignoring its deep philosophical roots. Some say that this shift is merely the natural result of academic specialization. Mathematics split from philosophy, and science split from spirituality. But this raises a deeper and more profound question. By erasing the sacred layer of meaning from these symbols, have we lost a vital part of our civilization's memory? For our ancestors, geometry was not just about measurement. It was a sacred language that could be used to express what words could not. Even in the 21st century, some architects, like Christopher Alexander and his team, have attempted to revive the spirit of sacred geometry in their designs. They argue that certain shapes, proportions, and spatial rhythms have direct and measurable psychological and physiological effects on human beings. Yet, such views remain on the fringes of the architectural world, rarely incorporated into the training of new architects. Today, when we open a geometry textbook, we see a collection of diagrams and formulas of sharp edges and precise angles. But we see very few explanations for why these shapes once mattered so deeply to those who came before us. And perhaps this is the quietest and most insidious loss of all. When knowledge becomes purely technical, it loses its voice, its ability to tell stories, to connect, and to inspire, the very qualities that once allowed humans not only to measure the world, but to find profound meaning within it. If the distortion of sacred geometry reduced ancient symbols to soulless diagrams, then the story of ancient Mesopotamian archaeology reveals a different and more subtle pattern of control. This is a story of how language itself was deliberately retranslated, edited, and interpreted through the narrow lens of existing assumptions about civilization. When 19th century European archaeologists first began to excavate the ruins of Sumer and Akkad, the great civilizations of the Mesopotamian cradle, they unearthed a massive corpus of cuneiform texts. These clay tablets contained a wealth of information, from tax ledgers and trade contracts to complex legal codes and epic cosmic myths. Their discovery shattered the long-held Western belief that human progress had begun in Egypt and Greece. Instead, it became clear that the Sumerians had already built cities, developed sophisticated legal systems, and invented writing as early as the 4th millennium BCE. But precisely because these findings were so foundational, the translation of cuneiform script quickly became a battleground for academic and ideological control. As early as the late 1800s, scholars, particularly those in Britain and France, were often compelled to shape their translations to suit the expectations of their wealthy patrons and their academic institutions. In this highly charged environment, sensitive passages were either softened, omitted entirely, or reworded if they happened to clash with biblical narratives or the prevailing religious views of the time. A clear example of this can be seen in the translation of the Epic of Atrahasis, a Sumerian flood myth that closely mirrors the biblical story of Noah. While the parallels between the two stories were striking, George Smith's 1876 translation selectively included only the non-controversial sections of the epic, leaving out key moments, such as the god Enlil's expression of remorse for having wiped out humanity. That particular detail, the idea that gods might be fallible, was simply too theologically unsettling for its time. It was only in the 20th century that full and unedited translations of the epic finally emerged, but by then, school curricula had already adopted the simplified and sanitized version. Similarly, the early translations of Sumerian legal codes, which are the precursors to Hammurabi's famous laws, were often tailored to emphasize their similarities to the laws found in the Old Testament, thereby reinforcing the biblical claim to authority over moral law. Important differences, such as the presence of restorative justice models or systems of social compensation, were often downplayed or removed entirely from the commentary. Another rarely discussed case is that of the Sumerian king list, which describes dynasties of kings who were said to have ruled for tens of thousands of years. In the 19th and 20th century editions of this text, many scholars simply adjusted these timelines, converting 28,800 years to 288 years in order to avoid clashing with the established biblical chronologies. It is only in the direct transliterations of the original text that these vast and seemingly impossible numbers remain. Most of the widely circulated translations feature these corrected versions, which are designed to be more palatable to a Western audience. And here lies the deeper issue. These early, biased translations have profoundly shaped how modern education presents Mesopotamian civilization. When an ancient culture is filtered through the political and theological lens of a later age, our ability to understand it honestly and on its own terms becomes profoundly limited. To be fair, later generations of scholars have worked hard to correct these early biases. Since the mid-20th century, independent research teams in Germany, the United States, and Japan have released more complete, line-by-line translations that are cross-referenced with the original cuneiform signs. Yet, ironically, these more accurate and nuanced versions are rarely found in standard textbooks, which tend to favor the older, simplified editions that are easier to teach and less likely to provoke controversy. Today, anyone who is interested in the civilizations of Sumer and Akkad faces a choice. They can read concise and safe summaries that strip out all the complexity, or they can wade through thousands of pages of dense sign charts in pursuit of the civilization's authentic voice, a voice that is often stranger, more nuanced, and far more sophisticated than our modern frameworks are ready to acknowledge. And perhaps the final question is not whether this distortion was done with malice, but whether it stemmed from a quiet and deeply ingrained fear of confronting truths that simply did not fit the stories we were already being told. If the mistranslation of Sumerian text shows how knowledge can be carefully shaped at the level of language, then the story of out-of-sequence archaeological discoveries reveals a deeper and more chilling fear, that the institution of science itself can punish those who dare to question its foundational assumptions. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, numerous archaeologists, geologists, and anthropologists published what they believed to be shocking findings. Advanced tools, human traces, or signs of civilization that appeared in geological layers far too old for modern humans or any known civilization to have existed. These announcements did not just stir up debate. In many cases, they destroyed careers. One of the most infamous cases is that of Dr. Virginia C. McIntyre, an American geologist. In 1966, She participated in a survey at the site of Huitlaco, Mexico, where her colleagues discovered a collection of sophisticated stone tools buried deep beneath a layer of volcanic ash. Using multiple dating methods, including uranium series and zircon fission track analysis, her team dated the site to approximately 250,000 years ago, well before Homo sapiens were believed to have existed, let alone to have been crafting such advanced tools. Initially, the team prepared to publish their groundbreaking findings, but the backlash from the academic community came swiftly and fiercely. Mainstream experts dismissed the dating as flawed, suggesting that the tools must have fallen into older strata or that the measurements themselves were mistaken. When Steve McIntyre stood by her team's data, she was quietly sidelined. Prestigious scientific journals refused to publish her work. Her teaching contracts were not renewed. Years later, she was still unable to find a permanent research position. In a personal letter, she wrote, "I wasn't rejected for weak data. I was rejected because my data didn't fit the story they wanted to preserve." Another case is that of Thomas E. Lee, a Canadian archaeologist. In the 1950s, he excavated thousands of stone artifacts near Lake Huron, Ontario, which were found embedded within glacial soil layers. These findings suggested a human presence in North America tens of thousands of years earlier than the accepted Bering Land Bridge theory allowed. When Lee refused to back down from his conclusions, the museum that employed him cut his funding, removed his entire collection from public exhibition, and relegated it to storage. He was eventually dismissed from his position and spent the rest of his life unable to secure funding for any new research. Then there is the work of Michael Cremo, the author of Forbidden Archaeology, who has spent years meticulously collecting forgotten archaeological reports. Among the hundreds of cases he has documented, he found numerous discoveries from the 19th and 20th centuries that were removed from public archives simply for being out of sequence. While some of these can undoubtedly be attributed to technical error or a lack of modern dating instruments, many others were dismissed without any independent re-examination, solely because they conflicted with the established timelines of human history. To be clear, science rightly demands rigorous standards of evidence. But the paradox is this: extraordinary and potentially paradigm-shifting data is often excluded from the conversation before it can even be properly scrutinized. It is discarded not for its poor quality, but for being too disruptive to the established order. Today, when such findings are mentioned, mainstream science typically labels them as fringe theories, unworthy of any serious discussion. But independent researchers continue to ask, if these claims are wrong, why not refute them through transparent reanalysis and open replication of the data? Why is the response so often defunding, silence, or professional exile? The answer is elusive because, like all established knowledge systems, science has a powerful inertia. Once a theoretical framework has been built up over generations, any contradictory data is often seen not as a new opportunity for discovery, but as a threat to order. And not everyone is willing to risk their reputation, their career, or their sense of meaning itself in defense of outlier evidence. And so, as often happens, the void left by these rejected discoveries becomes fertile ground for legend. Legends of prehistoric civilizations, of ancient humans far more advanced than we have ever imagined, or simply the legend of science that, while claiming to seek the truth, still seems to fear the data that doesn't fit within its own carefully constructed frame. If out-of-sequence discoveries can derail a researcher's career within a matter of months, then within the quieter and more polished halls of international academic conferences, gatekeeping still exists, but it operates in a more discreet and sophisticated manner. Here, censorship requires no formal announcement or court ruling. It often arrives in the form of a single, carefully chosen phrase. Conflicts with research direction academic conferences, which are often hosted by major universities, research foundations, or intergovernmental bodies, serve as critical platforms for introducing new discoveries, debating interpretations, and cross-checking evidence. But they're also the places where certain topics quietly and mysteriously vanish from the program, often without any detailed explanation, especially when those topics touch upon chronological disputes, pre-civilizational hypotheses, or any questions that might challenge the accepted historical frameworks. One well-known case emerged at a conference in Germany that was focused on Göbekli Tepe, the 12,000-year-old megalithic site. In 2012, a group of young Eastern European archaeologists submitted a paper that questioned whether the site was not just ritualistic in nature, but also had a sophisticated astronomical function, a discovery that would imply a level of societal organization far beyond what is currently expected of hunter-gatherer societies. The abstract for their paper was initially accepted and was even included in the official conference program. But just weeks before the event was scheduled to take place, the paper was quietly pulled with a vague and unhelpful note that it lacked academic maturity, a polite euphemism that is often used to avoid open controversy. In 1999, at a North American prehistory conference that was being hosted by a prominent U.S. university, an independent archaeologist attempted to present his findings from the Topper site in South Carolina, where stone fragments have been found that suggested human activity dating back as far as 50,000 years. The proposal for his paper passed the early peer review process, but when several of the conference's major funders objected, the organizing committee removed the paper from the schedule, citing an insufficient consensus on the topic. Behind closed doors, colleagues advised the researcher to accept a quiet withdrawal of his paper rather than risk escalating the situation. Similar patterns can be seen in Egyptology conferences, where papers that explore theories about undisclosed chambers beneath the Great Pyramid of Giza are frequently omitted from the official programs, even though radar scans and seismic data supporting these theories have been published in minor academic proceedings. The reason often given for these omissions is the need to avoid encouraging sensationalism, or to prevent damaging the scientific credibility of Egyptology. Beneath these polite rejections lies a subtle, two-layer exclusion system. The first layer is the standard peer review process, which is a necessary filter to ensure the quality of the research being presented. The second and much subtler layer is a form of institutional caution, where conference organizers and their funders grow uneasy about any discovery that might destabilize the historical consensus. Some defend this system as being pragmatic, not a conspiracy, but simply a shield against media sensationalism and pseudoscientific exploitation. After all, when an unverified theory is broadcast to the public without proper scrutiny, it can erode the credibility of an entire academic discipline. But critics push back, asking, if controversial data is always delayed or omitted from the conversation, how can the scientific community ever evaluate it transparently? As a result, many of these topics remain buried in internal reports or published in obscure journals with minimal reach. Theories about older human dates, prehistoric intercontinental trade, or early astronomical knowledge are quietly relegated to a space outside of the mainstream. And in that space, a quiet but persistent question continues to grow. How many important discoveries have been blocked? Not because they were wrong, but because they risked shaking the historical scaffolding that we have all come to lean on. Today, as we browse through the sleek and impressive programs of modern academic conferences, filled with hundreds of safe papers, few of us ever pause to wonder what might be missing. Somewhere beyond the printed schedule, there may exist a second, invisible list. The list of topics that were quietly crossed out and may never be brought to light. If sensitive archaeological topics are often quietly removed from international conferences in order to avoid controversy, then sometimes the story turns even more dramatic when the physical artifacts themselves simply vanish, leaving behind a profound and inexplicable void with no official explanation. Among the most baffling of these cases is the mysterious disappearance of 13 crates of Inca and pre-Inca artifacts, which were lost somewhere between Peru and Europe in the early 20th century. The story began in 1926, when a joint archaeological expedition of Peruvian and French scholars was excavating a site in the Ayacucho region of Peru, an area that was once a major trade hub of the ancient Wari civilization, which preceded and was later absorbed by the mighty Inca Empire. Over the course of 4 months, the team collected hundreds of remarkable artifacts, including intricate gold masks, ceramic plates that were engraved with strange and unfamiliar symbols, and stone statues that depicted figures wearing headdresses unlike any known Inca style. Some of these items bore artistic elements that were completely foreign to known Inca styles, closely resembling carvings that had been seen in Polynesian or even Mesoamerican cultures, a detail that would later fuel intense speculation. According to the official customs records, the artifacts were carefully sealed into 13 large wooden crates, which were then inspected and signed off by both Peruvian officials and a French archaeological commissioner. The shipment was intended to be sent to Paris, where half of the artifacts would undergo restoration and be compared with the Louvre's extensive collections, while the other half would be returned to Lima for display in a museum. On August 12, 1927, the cargo departed from the port of Callao on a freight vessel that was bound for Le Havre, France. But when the ship finally arrived at its destination, the 13 crates were missing. The shipping company claimed that the cargo must have been unloaded at an unscheduled transfer port, but they never specified which one. The insurance documentation for the shipment was frustratingly vague. Since the shipment was state-owned, no private party had the legal grounds to demand compensation. While the Peruvian government did issue a formal request for an investigation, the French authorities released only a brief and unhelpful statement, suggesting that the shipment was likely just misplaced in transit, and the entire matter quietly faded from public view. What makes this disappearance so suspicious is not only its sheer scale. 13 large, sealed crates do not simply vanish into thin air, but also the unique nature of their contents. Some of the experts on the expedition had taken photographs and made detailed sketches of the items before they were packed. Among them were 3 small stone figures that resembled ancient ships, a circular disc that was engraved with coastal maps that did not match traditional Inca geography, and a series of magnificent gold masks that were crafted in a style that had never been found in any existing Peruvian collections. Various theories have emerged over the years to explain the disappearance. Some suspect that the crates were simply stolen and sold to wealthy European collectors at a time when the black market for pre-Columbian artifacts was thriving. Others believe that the disappearance was an intentional and deliberate cover-up, a way to eliminate artifacts that could have raised troubling questions about the possibility of early transoceanic contact, a theory that has long been rejected by mainstream historians. In 1951, a journalist from the magazine Paris Match attempted to track down the missing shipment in the archives of the port of Le Havre, but he discovered that all of the cargo records from the year 1927 had disappeared during World War II. The museums that were involved in the original project also claimed to no longer hold any relevant receipts, preserving only some faint and inconclusive correspondence between the expedition team and the French cultural authorities. The complete disappearance of the 13 crates turned the entire story into little more than a historical anecdote. But in 1996, a Swiss private collector displayed a gold mask that he claimed was from the missing shipment. Although absolute verification was impossible, the punched decorative holes and the intricate spiral motifs on the mask closely matched a field sketch that had been made in 1926. The international media picked up the story, prompting the Peruvian government to announce a new investigation. But once again, the files soon fell silent. Today, few Peruvian archaeologists are willing to revisit the case. Perhaps it is because it raises too many uncomfortable questions. Who decides what evidence is preserved in our national archives? Which objects accidentally vanish in transit? And which fragments of our history are excluded, not for being fraudulent, but for being too inconvenient? And when we confront the empty space that was once meant for those 13 crates, we come to a quiet and sobering realization. History does not always vanish in the flames of war or the chaos of a natural disaster. Sometimes, it simply disappears in silence, shaped by the hands that control the flow of our shared heritage. If the disappearance of 13 crates of Peruvian artifacts exposed a mysterious and deliberate break in the chain of cultural transmission, then the story of the Smithsonian Institution, the largest research and museum complex in the United States, reveals a more subtle and perhaps more insidious form of control, the quiet filtering of records, the strategic restriction of access to collections, and the careful guiding of the public narrative towards safe and pre-approved conclusions. Founded in 1846, the Smithsonian stated mission is the increase and diffusion of knowledge. Yet between the 1930s and the 1960s, a number of historians and independent researchers began to ask some uncomfortable questions. Why were so many thoroughly documented archaeological findings from the institution's own excavations never published, or, even worse, quietly removed from public records? One of the most frequently cited examples of this involves the so-called giant skeletons between the 1880s and the 1920s. Excavation teams working in the Ohio Valley and the Appalachian Mountains reported finding numerous human remains that were over 8 feet tall, often buried alongside sophisticated copper tools and ceremonial artifacts. Preliminary reports of these findings were submitted to the Smithsonian, and some of the early discoveries even appeared in prominent publications like the American Antiquarian and Scientific American. But by the 1930s, the detailed records of these excavations began to disappear from the public archives. According to independent researchers like the late Vine Deloria Jr., this was not merely an archival oversight. In 1944, a private archaeological group requested access to examine the remains from these digs. The Smithsonian responded that the records either did not exist or had been reclassified. When questioned by the U.S. Congress in 1950, representatives from the Smithsonian denied any policy of suppression, but they also failed to produce a single document that could explain why so many of these case files were now missing from the public archive. Another story surrounds the Lovelock Cave site in Nevada, where a wealth of ancient bones, textiles, and artifacts, some of which were dated to at least 4,000 years ago, were uncovered. Anthropologists who studied the remains noted that certain skulls displayed unusual morphological features that did not align with any known indigenous populations. Yet by the 1950s, most of these artifacts have been removed from public exhibits, and the original anthropological studies of them now exist only as indirect citations in obscure academic papers. In addition to bones, the Smithsonian during this period was also suspected of filtering the radiocarbon dating results from sites that suggested an unexpectedly early human presence in the Americas. At several excavation sites in the western United States, organic materials returned dates that exceeded 15,000 years, well before the widely accepted Clovis first theory, which held that humans had entered the Americas no earlier than 13,000 years ago. These inconvenient findings were often footnoted as contaminated samples and were quietly dropped from publication. Some historians argue that this was not a coordinated conspiracy, but rather a form of institutional self-defense. When new evidence contradicts a dominant and well-established theory like Clovis first, researchers often face the risk of losing their credibility, their funding, and their academic standing. This immense pressure often leads to delayed publication or the indefinite shelving of controversial findings, in the hope that a more favorable scholarly climate might emerge in the future. But the result is unmistakable: the creation of a shadow zone in American archaeology, a place where dozens of potentially significant findings were never properly vetted or debated by the wider scientific community. All that remains of them are vague ledger entries, scattered journal fragments, or the second-hand recollections of those who once saw the artifacts for themselves. Today, the Smithsonian remains a globally respected institution, housing millions of priceless items and welcoming millions of visitors each year. But if you ask independent researchers, they will tell you that behind the pristine public displays lie vast storerooms that only a select few are ever allowed to access. And perhaps, they will add, there are also case files that are deemed too complicated for public release, still waiting for a generation that is brave enough to bring them into the light. And perhaps the real question is not which hypothesis is correct, but rather, when silent censorship becomes habitual, how can we ever know what truths were excluded simply because they did not fit the version of history we were already prepared to accept? If archaeological records being recalled and sealed away has created significant gaps in our understanding of the past, then in the 20th century, a more subtle and modern form of censorship began to emerge. This was a form of censorship where entire documentary films quietly vanished from national archives, not due to technical loss or degradation, but because they touched upon historical topics that were deemed too sensitive to confront. From the very birth of cinema, documentary film has been a powerful and evocative tool for preserving our collective memory. In the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union, hundreds of filming crews captured precious footage of archaeological digs, international conferences, and interviews with the last living eyewitnesses to major historical events. Many of these films were initially designated as public assets and were stored in national repositories with the promise of long-term preservation for future generations. But over time, certain reels began to disappear or become restricted, not because they were damaged or had degraded, but because they revealed things that existed beyond the comfort zone of officially accepted historical narratives. One frequently cited case is that of a film that documented the early excavations at Teotihuacan, Mexico, from 1917 to 1920. The hour-long footage showed detailed close-ups of murals and foundational structures, including carvings that were visibly distinct from the later Aztec styles. According to historians who had the opportunity to view it, the film hinted that Teotihuacan may have originated from an even older and unknown culture, with possible trade connections to both Central America and the Andes. The film was initially housed in the Library of Congress, but it was quietly labeled as restricted in the 1950s, just as new dating hypotheses for the site were being rejected by the mainstream as speculative. Although brief segments of the film have appeared in other documentaries over the years, the full original film has never been released. When Archaeology magazine requested access to it in 1973, they were told that the film had been temporarily withdrawn for content review. That status has not changed since. A similar story comes from the United Kingdom, where a 1936 film titled The Hidden Mounds documented a series of surveys of ancient earthworks in Somerset. The footage included a remarkable scene where the archaeologists appeared visibly surprised to uncover Roman-style, floral brickwork buried beneath sediment layers that had been dated to the Bronze Age. The film was initially screened publicly in the 1940s, but it was later removed from the archives in the 1960s during a catalog review that was conducted by the Historic Preservation Office. The stated reason for its removal was unverified accuracy. Some copies of the film that were held by regional libraries were recalled for indefinite storage. Even in the post-war era, when transparency was supposedly the new standard, numerous other films received the sensitive material designation. In the United States, the National Archaeological Archive once held footage from a series of excavations in Nevada where stone tools were found in geological layers that were deemed too ancient for the prevailing Clovis first theory. After a few limited test screenings, the film vanished completely from public circulation. Today, only a few still images from it remain, hidden away in older research volumes. Some argue that these removals are not evidence of malice, but are simply a matter of institutional caution. In our modern media-driven society, a misinterpreted film clip can quickly become a sensationalist claim, undermining public trust in mainstream academia. But others push back, arguing that if the public is only ever allowed to see pre-approved, safe narratives, then silence itself becomes the breeding ground for conspiracy theories. To this day, restricted film catalogs still exist in national repositories around the world. The official reasons given for these restrictions range from historical sensitivity and lack of scientific consensus to protecting the reputations of the individuals involved. Yet, most independent researchers agree on one thing. Without transparency and an open review process, we will never know what these films truly contain or why they were locked away in the first place. And perhaps the greatest irony of all is this: we now live in a digital age, an era of open data and instant access to information. Yet, entire visual records of our past remain sealed away in vaults, their contents hidden not by the ravages of decay or disaster, but by deliberate decisions that have deemed them too inconvenient to the stories we have grown comfortable telling. When we speak of historical fragments that have been sidelined for being too sensitive, few artifacts have stirred as much long-standing and passionate debate as the Pyrie Reis map, a 500-year-old piece of gazelle skin that is often cited as an enigma that defies the conventional narrative of post-medieval cartography. Pyrie Reis, an accomplished admiral of the Ottoman Navy, a skilled geographer, and a seasoned explorer, drew this remarkable map in the year 1513. He used a wide variety of sources that he had collected from sailors, merchants, and even maps that he attributed to the Franks, the Ottoman term for various European peoples. Today, only about one-third of the original map survives, and it is currently held at the Topkapi Palace Library in Istanbul. At first glance, the map resembles a typical 16th-century portolan chart, with its detailed coastlines, well-marked nautical routes, and numerous annotations describing the coastal fauna and the peoples of different regions. But what has kept this map at the center of both scholarly and popular debate for so many years is its southern section. This section depicts a landmass that stretches well beyond the known coast of South America, and it bears a striking resemblance to the coastline of Antarctica. According to our accepted history, Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820. Yet, Pyrie Reis not only seemed to acknowledge its existence, but he also illustrated its coastal contour with an uncanny accuracy, particularly the curved coastline of Queen Maud Land, which modern satellite imagery has since confirmed. Proponents of the ancient, unacknowledged cartography theory argue that the map's depiction of this landmass mirrors its pre-glacial terrain, suggesting that it might have been drawn from sources that dated back to a time when Antarctica was not yet covered in ice. Mainstream academia, however, has long met such claims with extreme caution. For decades, Western institutions have classified this portion of the map as a work of imaginative embellishment, a common Renaissance cartographic habit of filling in unknown regions of the world with speculative coastlines. This interpretation has made its way into countless textbooks and museum displays, effectively neutralizing the map's more provocative implications by celebrating it as a curious and beautiful blend of fact and fantasy. Yet, not all scholars have agreed with this assessment. Charles Hapgood, a historian of science at Keene College, became the most prominent figure to champion the idea that the Pyrie Reis map was based on far older source materials. In his 1966 book, Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, Hapgood provided a detailed geodetic analysis of the map, arguing that the projection techniques used to create it were far too accurate for the early 1500s. He even consulted with the U.S. Air Force, which reportedly confirmed that there were notable similarities between the map's depiction of the coastline and the actual subglacial topography of Antarctica. Despite this, Hapgood's work was largely dismissed by mainstream geography and history departments for lacking any corroborating archaeological evidence. Others in the academic world simply avoided the topic altogether, wary that the debate had been co-opted by fringe theorists and proponents of Atlantis-style speculation. Over the years, numerous books and documentaries about the Pyrie Reis map have been filed under a semi-academic label, a space where the line between serious inquiry and sensationalism often blurs. As a result, the general public is rarely exposed to the full and complex debate surrounding the map. Was it simply a clever fusion of known coastlines and imaginative filler? Or is it a tantalizing clue to a sophisticated maritime knowledge base that once existed and was later lost to history? Today, the Pyrie Reis map remains safely behind glass in Istanbul, muted under layers of UV filtering protection. Visitors admire the ancient drawings, but most of them leave with a neatly packaged and simplified explanation. A beautiful map, but ultimately inaccurate. And perhaps that quiet and dismissive attitude is the most telling part of this entire story. Because sometimes the easiest way to neutralize an inconvenient artifact is not to ban it, but simply to reduce it to a piece of imaginative artwork and then let the passage of time do the rest. If the Pyrie Reis map hints at a level of maritime knowledge that seems to defy its age, then the story of ancient Polynesian navigation makes an even bolder point. Have we, as a global culture, silently narrowed humanity's collective memory of seafaring to fit the comfortable belief that the Age of Discovery was a uniquely European invention? For centuries, the Polynesian people crossed the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean aboard massive double-hulled canoes, known as vaca, which were capable of traveling thousands of kilometers across the open sea without the aid of compasses or paper maps. Instead, they relied on intricate mental navigation charts, which were memorized through chants and rituals. They used the paths of the stars, the shapes of the ocean swells, the direction of the wind, and the seasonal migration patterns of seabirds to guide them on their long journeys. These complex navigational routes were passed down from generation to generation through a rich oral tradition, not through writing. When Spanish, Dutch, and British explorers began to land on the shores of Tahiti, Hawaii, and Aotearoa, New Zealand, between the 16th and 18th centuries, they were stunned by the incredible precision of the local navigators. Captain James Cook himself wrote in his journals, "They drew in the sand a chart more intricate than any sea map we carried." What is rarely acknowledged today is that many of these early European expeditions meticulously documented these native navigational routes, often using them as a reference for their own trade and military voyages. In the naval archives of Britain, France, and Spain, there are handwritten maps and travelogues that describe the anchoring points, wind directions, ocean depths, and seasonal movement patterns that were shared with them by Polynesian navigators. Some of these records even note that European captains would hire local wayfinders to guide their own ships on long transoceanic journeys. Yet by the 19th century, as the European empires sought to claim for themselves the sole prestige of maritime discovery, these native routes began to quietly vanish from the official naval manuals. One little-known example of this is the Tahiti-New Zealand Sea Route, which was recopied in Sydney in 1826 and was subsequently stored in the British Admiralty archives. This document depicted not only the positions of the islands, but it also included detailed annotations about wave rhythms and a sophisticated navigation technique called Lapa, which involved observing the subtle flashes of light that are transmitted through ocean swells, a technique that allowed navigators to detect the presence of islands from a great distance. By the late 19th century, this vital document had been reclassified as ethnographic notes and was no longer considered to be valid maritime data. Likewise, in the French naval manuals of the 1860s, there existed a section on the sea routes through Tuamotu, Rapa Nui, and the Marquesas Islands, which included detailed Polynesian wind direction markers. But in the later editions of these manuals, this entire section simply disappeared without any explanation. Its invaluable content is now preserved only in scattered references that are hidden away within the vast collections of the French National Library. Why were these crucial routes removed from the official records? Some historians argue that it was a natural result of standardization, as European navies began to adopt magnetic compasses, sextants, and chronometers, rendering the ancient techniques of oral navigation seemingly obsolete. But researchers like David Lewis, the author of The Navigators, argue otherwise. They contend that this omission reflected a deeper and more profound dismissal of indigenous knowledge, precisely because it did not align with the emerging narrative of Europe as the sole discoverer of the world's oceans. In the 20th century, as post-colonial studies began to gain ground, a new generation of Polynesian navigators began to reconstruct these ancient routes through a series of live expeditions. The most famous of these was the Voyage of the Klee, a traditional double-hulled canoe that was guided by Maupielug, a master Micronesian wayfinder. In 1976, he sailed the canoe 4,800 kilometers from Hawaii to Tahiti without using any modern instruments. The journey's triumphant success forced the world to admit that these so-called mythic skills were not only real, but were also astonishingly accurate. Today, many of the hand-drawn maps that were once dismissed as mere folklore are being digitized and studied, though few members of the public realize that for over a century, they were treated as legitimate navigational records until they were quietly removed from mainstream history in order to preserve the myth of Western maritime supremacy. And perhaps the most sobering thought of all is this. When a people leave no written records, their knowledge is easily discounted, even if that knowledge once carried them halfway across the planet, long before the Europeans even knew how vast the world truly was. If the disappearance of Polynesian sea routes from official records reflected a subtle but pervasive dismissal of indigenous knowledge, then this next story carries even more weight. The hypothesis that African sailors may have reached the Americas long before Columbus, a topic that was once discussed in early 20th century archaeological literature, has since been systematically pushed to the very margins of history. For decades, the mainstream narratives of the Western Hemisphere have rested on the foundational idea that Columbus was the first to connect the Old and New worlds, thereby beginning the so-called Age of Discovery. Yet, scattered across Central and South America, there are a series of puzzling traces, stone carvings that depict unfamiliar facial features, unusual alloyed copper artifacts, and the remains of seeds that are not native to the Americas. One of the first scholars to seriously raise this issue was Leo Wiener, a distinguished Harvard linguist. In his three-volume work, Africa and the Discovery of America, 1920 to 1922, he argued that certain techniques for processing cotton and cultivating bananas in Mexico and Peru bore remarkable similarities to West African methods. He also pointed to a number of linguistic overlaps, ritual customs, and artistic motifs that closely resembled Mande and Yoruba traditions. Although critics at the time dismissed these connections as mere coincidences, Wiener's work was, for a time, regarded as serious scholarship. In the 1960s and 70s, the historian Ivan van Sertima reignited the debate with his controversial and highly influential book, They Came Before Columbus, 1976. He went even further, claiming that the colossal Olmec stone heads, which were carved with broad noses and full lips, were in fact stone memories of contact with West African sailors or merchants in the 13th to 14th centuries. He also cited Spanish colonial records in which explorers like Balboa and other chroniclers described encountering dark-skinned people living along the Panamanian coast. But from that point on, the theory met with intense and organized resistance. Many academic institutions labeled it as fringe scholarship, citing a conspicuous lack of definitive genetic or archaeological proof. By the 1980s, American history textbooks had almost entirely removed any references to the possibility of African pre-Columbian contact. In modern curricula, the Olmec heads are described as being distinctively indigenous, and any alternative interpretations are bracketed as unaccepted theories. The irony is that some aspects of this argument have never been fully debunked. For example, the presence of an Old World cotton species, Gossypium herbaceum, in pre-Columbian archaeological layers remains unexplained. Botanists have acknowledged that transoceanic seed dispersal by human agents cannot be ruled out. Yet, such data are consistently excluded from mainstream textbooks due to a lack of consensus. At major archaeological conferences, proposals for panels on this topic have been repeatedly declined. The reason usually given is a diplomatic one, to avoid unnecessary political or racial controversy. But in doing so, the public is denied access to an open and critical scholarly debate, and the evidence remains hidden from any meaningful scrutiny. Modern researchers like Runoko Rashidi and Clyde Winters continue to gather supporting data, but their work is often dismissed as being peripheral to the mainstream. Still, the appeal of the idea endures because it poses a compelling and powerful question. If Africans did once cross the Atlantic, does the entire narrative of the discovery of the Americas change from a simple story of conquest to a far more complex and multifaceted meeting of civilizations? Today, this theory is largely absent from all official curricula. The Olmec heads remain on quiet display in museums, labeled simply circa 1200 to 400 BC, with no definitive explanation for why their facial features do not seem to resemble any other known Mesoamerican sculpture. And perhaps this is the most uncomfortable question of all. When a hypothesis does not fit the standardized Eurocentric story, is it ever truly given a fair chance to be heard? Or is it quietly excluded simply because it forces us to redefine who arrived first. If pre-Columbian transoceanic journeys present a serious challenge to the Eurocentric narratives of first contact, then Puma Punku, a megalithic complex that rests silently on Bolivia's high Altiplano Plateau, poses a different kind of riddle entirely. How did a civilization with no known written records manage to produce stonework that is so incredibly precise that even our most advanced modern engineers struggle to replicate it? Puma Punku, which is part of the larger Tiwanaku archaeological site, consists of enormous sandstone and diorite blocks, some of which weigh tens of tons. These blocks have been carved with mirror-smooth finishes and have been drilled with precisely angled holes. Many of the H-shaped stones that are scattered across the site feature parallel surfaces that are accurate to within a millimeter, with beveled edges that are perfectly consistent across the entire perimeter of the stone, attributes that, even today, leave modern stonemasons completely astonished. The first major scientific studies of the site were conducted by Arthur Poznański in the early 20th century. Over a period of nearly 5 decades, he meticulously measured, mapped, and compared the site's alignments with astronomical data. In his final years, Poznański concluded that Puma Punku might be over 15,000 years old, an estimate that drew fierce and immediate opposition from the European archaeologists of his time. After his death, his extensive research was scattered, and much of it was never published in full. In the 1950s, new excavation teams from the United States and Germany returned to the Tiwanaku site. While their radiocarbon dating of nearby agricultural layers suggested a more conservative age of about 1,500 years for the site, no further investigation into how the stones at Puma Punku were shaped was ever pursued. By the end of the 20th century, despite the fact that the enigmatic blocks remained fully exposed and largely intact, all official excavation at the Puma Punku section of the site had largely ceased. A lingering and deeply puzzling question remains. Why has a full and comprehensive survey of the site, using modern tools like laser scanning and advanced imaging, never been organized? Independent researchers like Christopher Dunn, along with several teams of geological engineers, have conducted their own private surveys of the site. They have suggested that the shaping of the hard diorite stone would have required techniques that go far beyond the simple use of hammers and copper chisels. Yet, any proposals for formal research funding for the site are almost always rejected, with the stated reason often being a lack of a clear theoretical framework. Some academics argue that the limited budgets for archaeology should be prioritized for sites that have writing or a rich textual history. But others find this rationale to be insufficient, especially since the stones at Puma Punku are sitting right on the surface, easily accessible, and requiring no deep or expensive excavation. That very convenience, critics argue, makes the official silence on the matter even more suspicious. Is this a calculated and deliberate silence, meant to avoid having to answer difficult and potentially paradigm-shifting questions? Today, when tourists visit Puma Punku, their local guides will mention the great Tiwanaku civilization and then quickly move on. There is no detailed exhibit at the site on the stone-shaping techniques that were used, and there is no discussion of how massive blocks weighing over 100 tons were moved across the high-altitude terrain. A single, simple sign reads Puma Punku, circa 5th to 10th century CE, and nothing more. There in the thin, cold air of the high Andes, the stones remain massive, immobile, and eerily precise. They may not be supernatural, but when established research teams decline to return to the site, and when modern surveys are indefinitely postponed or canceled, silence itself becomes a form of soft censorship, subtle, yet highly effective. What makes Puma Punku so extraordinary may not be just the stones themselves, but the way in which it reveals how even the field of archaeology can flinch in the face of something that it cannot easily explain, choosing instead to look away in order to preserve the narrative status quo. And so, the blocks are left to weather under the harsh sun and the driving rain, as if time alone might eventually erase the question, along with the memory of the hands that once shaped them. If Puma Punku raises uncomfortable questions about a technology that seems to be far beyond its time. Then the story of the Olmec civilization's ethnic origins reveals a different kind of discomfort, a profound reluctance to acknowledge that pre-Columbian transoceanic contact may have shaped a legacy that is far more complex than the tidy and convenient narrative of isolated development. The Olmec, who emerged around 1500 BCE along Mexico's Gulf Coast, are widely considered to be the mother civilization of Mesoamerica, having laid the cultural groundwork for the later Maya, Aztec, and other great civilizations. They left behind impressive pyramids, an early form of hieroglyphic writing, and, most iconically, a series of colossal stone heads, each weighing between 20 and 50 tons, whose distinct facial features have sparked intense debate for over a century. The giant heads that have been found at sites like La Venta and San Lorenzo display broad noses, full lips, and low cheekbones, traits that are distinctly different from the stylized and angular faces that are commonly seen in other forms of Mesoamerican art. Early observers of these heads, including Matthew Stirling, who led the landmark 1938 American excavation of the site, remarked on their non-native features and noted their striking resemblance to West African morphology. Stirling, however, wisely stopped short of drawing any definitive conclusions. By the 1960s and 1970s, in the midst of the U.S. civil rights movement, some African-descended scholars, most notably Ivan van Sertima, openly proposed that the Olmec heads were, in fact, stone-carved memories of transatlantic contact, possibly with Mande merchants or sailors from the Mali Empire. His 1976 book, They Came Before Columbus, introduced this theory to the wider public, offering a comparative facial analysis of the heads and citing Spanish colonial records that described dark-skinned people living along the coast of Panama. But that moment also marked the beginning of a strong and organized pushback from the academic establishment. By the 1980s, most mainstream academic institutions began to reframe the narrative surrounding the Olmec heads in their school books and museum exhibits. Where some earlier scholars had cautiously suggested an African resemblance, newer interpretations began to emphasize the head's stylized aesthetics, calling them idealized depictions of local Olmec rulers. Some texts even argued that the broad features were merely symbolic of authority, not literal representations of physical traits. This interpretation is not entirely without merit. To date, no direct DNA evidence has been found to link the Olmecs to Africa, and simple morphological comparisons can often oversimplify complex ethnic identities. But what concerns many independent researchers is not the debate itself, but the way in which the entire topic has been quietly removed from public discourse, rather than being evaluated in an open and critical discussion. In 1990, an international conference at Tulane University had planned to hold a roundtable discussion titled Morphological Elements and the Possibility of Transoceanic Contact, but just months before the event was scheduled to take place, the panel was canceled, with the organizers citing the need to avoid racially charged controversy. The topic then vanished completely from the official proceedings of the conference. Even in Mexico, the National Institute of Anthropology and History remains extremely cautious on the subject. While some local scholars will acknowledge the atypical features of the heads, they typically offer neutral interpretations, such as calling them part of an elite stylistic tradition, thereby avoiding the deeper and more controversial implications. So the question lingers: why do the colossal heads bear such unmistakably distinct features if there was no external contact at all? Some independent researchers continue to suggest the possibility of West African voyages or the presence of foreign merchant classes who may have influenced the elite imagery of the Olmecs. But these theories rarely make it into mainstream educational materials. Historians note that this silence may not stem from a coordinated conspiracy, but rather from a form of post-colonial hypersensitivity around the issue of race. Scholars may fear being misinterpreted or being aligned with political extremism, from the pseudo-history of white supremacists to an overzealous Pan-Africanism. And so, rather than risk controversy, the entire field has opted for silence. Yet, that silence may be the most dangerous space of all. When legitimate debate is shut down entirely. The truth, whatever it may be, becomes fertile ground for myth, speculation, and intense polarization. Today, visitors stand before the magnificent Olmec heads, their enigmatic stone eyes fixed on the distant horizon. The museum label reads simply, Olmec Head, circa 900 BCE. A distinct artistic style. There is no further comment, no deeper context. And perhaps that is the most difficult question of all. If a civilization truly was more complex than our standardized histories allow, are we willing to accept that cultural identity has never been just about borders or skin color? Or will we continue to choose the version of history that simply feels more comfortable? If the Olmec heads challenged archaeologists with their unfamiliar faces, then the story of certain ancient Chinese world maps reveals something even more unsettling. That global geographical knowledge may have been far more advanced in China, long before Europe's so-called Age of Discovery. Yet this knowledge was quietly shelved and sealed away for centuries. Among the most debated of these examples is the Qianlong Kun Yu Chuan II, or the Qianlong Global Map, a large, hand-painted silk scroll that is believed to have been completed in the early Qing dynasty. The map appeared in the imperial archives around the year 1763. And while it portrays Asia, Europe, and Africa with a surprising degree of accuracy, it is its depictions of the American coastlines and the eastern island chains that puzzle researchers the most. The annotations on the map describe territories that closely resemble Polynesia and even New Zealand. The Qianlong map was not unique. Other, similar versions, like the Highway Gigwa map of overseas countries, circulated in limited circles and were used by scholars in Qing diplomatic missions. In these maps, America is labeled as the Great Western Continent, *Dashiyangzhou*, and the southern polar region is marked as the White Lands, described as a place of eternal snow, inaccessible to ships. In the 19th century, several Western scholars became intrigued by these remarkable maps. Some dismissed them as being Jesuit-inspired hybrids, arguing that they had simply borrowed their knowledge from the European maps that had been introduced to China during the preceding Ming era. But the problem with this theory was that several of the details on the Chinese maps did not align with the European maps of the same time period. Notably, the Qianlong map shows a continuous west coast of the Americas stretching from the north to the south, while European maps of the same period still often treated California as a potential island. Modern Chinese scholars, such as Professor Liu Xen, have proposed that these maps may have drawn their information from a wide range of sources, including Arab maritime data, the accounts of Ming dynasty navigators, and the folklore of merchants. Others are more cautious, treating them as semi-fantastical political statements that were aimed at reinforcing the Qing dynasty's image of a world that existed under its all-encompassing tributary vision. Whatever their origins, one fact stands out. From the late 18th century onward, the Qing court ordered these maps to be sealed, labeling them as imperial property and strictly forbidding any reproduction of them. According to the Qing veritable records, Qing Shirlu a 1790 edict instructed the Ministry of Rights to catalog over 200 sensitive maps, citing concerns about revealing the details of frontier and foreign territories to outsiders. When the Qing dynasty finally collapsed, many of these precious maps were lost or damaged. A few surviving scrolls were sold abroad in the early 20th century and now sit in private collections scattered across Europe and Japan. Due to the fragmented nature of the records, no one can definitively say whether these maps were based on first-hand observation or merely a collage of speculation and rumor. What is striking is how, as European maritime dominance rose in the world, these Chinese maps completely disappeared from the educational narratives. In the official version of world history, Asian geography was reduced to being insular and self-contained, while figures like Columbus and Magellan became the unchallenged heroes of global exploration. It was not until the late 20th century that writers like Gavin Menzies, despite his controversial claims, brought popular attention back to the idea that Chinese explorers may have mapped more of the world than had been previously thought. While many professional historians have rejected Menzies' conclusions, they also acknowledge a crucial point. The Qing government's deliberate censorship of its own geographic data suggests a kind of nervousness, as if the maps themselves revealed too much to be left unguarded. Today, within the archives of the Forbidden City in Beijing, some of these ancient maps still exist, though they are rarely digitized and even more rarely studied. Visitors who ask to see them are told politely, "These are imperial court documents, and they are not representative of official geographic knowledge." And perhaps the deeper question is not whether the maps are accurate, but who gets to decide whether civilization's far-reaching vision of the world deserves to be remembered. When memory is sealed away for the sake of convenience, history becomes much easier to tell and much easier to believe. If the Qing dynasty's sealing of its global maps reflected a deep-seated fear of knowledge straying beyond its control, then in the 20th and 21st centuries, a more sophisticated and subtle form of control has emerged, one that operates not through overt censorship in the traditional sense, but by quietly shaping which research is allowed to exist in the first place. This is the powerful and often invisible realm of academic gatekeeping, where unseen networks of influence quietly determine who gets funding, who gets published, and ultimately what gets taught to the public. Academia often presents itself as an open and meritocratic forum, where logic and evidence reign supreme. But behind the scenes, there are deeply entrenched networks of influence, where those who oversee the peer review process, the allocation of research funding, and the development of university curricula often collaborate, whether intentionally or not, to maintain the established intellectual boundaries. One frequently cited example of this is the immense influence of major intergovernmental and private research funders, from the Rockefeller Foundation and the Ford Foundation to the U.S. Social Science Research Council. Independent scholars have long pointed out that in order to obtain funding for archaeological or anthropological work, researchers must first align their proposals with the mainstream scientific directions of the field. This phrase sounds harmless enough, but in practice, it often means that if your proposal suggests something that is too far removed from the accepted models, such as the possibility of pre-Columbian transoceanic contact or the existence of advanced prehistoric civilizations, your chances of receiving a grant plummet to near zero. The result of this system is a profound paradox. Those who attempt to pursue bold and unconventional inquiries must often fund their own work, only to be later dismissed by the establishment for lacking official academic backing. In a 1998 interview, the archaeologist John Anthony West stated, "We don't lack evidence. We lack an academic system that is brave enough to publish it." This form of soft power does not just reside in grant committees. It also thrives on the editorial boards of prestigious academic journals, where a select few individuals have the power to decide what gets published. In 2002, the journal Antiquity was accused of rejecting numerous papers that presented new dating evidence from the sites of Tiwanaku and Pumapunku, with the journal citing the research as being too speculative. An anonymous editor later admitted, "We didn't want to reopen a debate that the field had worked so hard to put to rest 50 years ago." Another layer of control lies in the university curriculum boards, which have the power to determine what gets officially taught in our classrooms. In 2010, when a group of faculty at a U.S. university proposed adding a seminar on the topic of pre-Columbian transoceanic contact, the proposal was vetoed by the academic board for lacking a scholarly consensus. Of course, not all of this amounts to a grand conspiracy. Many of these decisions stem from a legitimate sense of caution. Allowing unvetted and sensationalist theories into our classrooms risks turning the field of archaeology into a playground for pseudoscience. But the line between maintaining intellectual rigor and actively suppressing new ideas can be razor thin. Some historians call this the field's self-defense mechanism, others are more blunt, describing it as an unnamed guild, a self-replicating network where established professors train protégés who then go on to become their colleagues, who in turn reinforce the very same intellectual boundaries. The outcome of this system is clear. Anyone who dares to step beyond the safety line, whether driven by passion or by compelling new data, often faces professional isolation. They receive no funding, no publications, and no access to the classroom. Eventually, they are branded as fringe. Today, if you attend a major archaeology conference, you will see a series of panels that look, on the surface, to be open-minded and inclusive. But if you look closer, you will notice what is absent. There is no serious discussion of the diorite carving techniques at Puma Punku or of the evidence for prehistoric Trans-Pacific trade. This is not because these ideas have been definitively debunked, but because they no longer fit comfortably inside the narrow framework that our academic institutions work so hard to preserve. And perhaps the most chilling truth of all is not that some secret society is pulling the strings from the shadows, but that an unspoken agreement now exists, one where no one needs to say out loud that certain questions should not be asked and that certain truths should not be spoken. If traditional academic gatekeeping has historically relied on controlling funding and publications, then the digital age has introduced a new and far more subtle form of censorship, one that is built not on overt bans, but on the power of algorithms and invisible editorial policies that quietly shape what the public is allowed to see when they search for knowledge. Many people assume that online platforms like Wikipedia, Google Scholar, and other open-access resources are free and neutral spaces, where all viewpoints can coexist and all sources are equally archived. But in reality, these platforms enforce stringent editorial hierarchies and complex ranking systems, so much so that certain controversial topics can nearly vanish from public view. Wikipedia, with its more than 6 million English-language articles, claims to adhere to a strict principle of neutral point of view. Yet, few people realize that articles that have been flagged as being controversial, such as those on pre-Columbian transoceanic contact, the Piri-Reis map, or the concept of ancient advanced civilizations, are often locked for editing by most users. The control over these entries rests with a small and exclusive cadre of administrators and trusted editors, who have the power to remove citations, to label entire sections as conspiracy theories, or to suppress certain pages from appearing in Wikipedia's own internal search results. In a 2017 interview, a former senior Wikipedia editor who used the pseudonym Jam admitted, "There are articles that we deliberately structure with a bias, not because we know that the content is wrong, but because no one wants Wikipedia to be associated with conspiracy theory culture." Google Scholar, which is the world's largest academic search engine, uses a series of complex algorithms that prioritize the prestige of the journal and the citation count of the article. This might sound reasonable on the surface, but it results in a system that monopolizes visibility for the mainstream journals, many of which deliberately avoid publishing controversial or unconventional hypotheses. As a result, independent research that is published in smaller or non-traditional journals gets buried deep in obscurity, where it is rarely ever seen by the average user. In 2015, a research team at the University of North Carolina conducted an experiment. They searched for the term pre-Columbian African contact with the Americas in the top 100 results on Google Scholar. Only 2 of the articles seriously explored the hypothesis. All the rest were either dismissive or highly skeptical. More than 50 original papers on the topic, which had been published in lesser-known journals or in conference proceedings, were nowhere to be found in the results. Another powerful mechanism of control is content steering, where the search suggestions themselves automatically lead users away from controversial topics. If you search for Puma Punku advanced stonework, Google will immediately suggest terms like Puma Punka hoax, Puma Punka debunked, or ancient aliens theory, subtly branding all genuine curiosity on the subject as being either fringe or false. Even platforms like Academia.edu and ResearchGate, which have been praised for their openness, use sophisticated filtering systems. While users can upload their papers freely, content that is tagged with labels like pseudo-archaeology or fringe theory is quietly deranked, excluded from the main directories, and removed from the discipline feeds. Some papers are even removed silently if they are reported for violating the platform's vague academic standards, often without any form of public peer review. To be fair, many of these precautions arise from a legitimate concern. The rapid spread of misinformation is a very real threat in our digital age. But the line between protecting the public and engaging in intellectual manipulation is not always clear. When a small handful of anonymous editors and algorithm designers have the power to decide what appears first in our search results, or what does not appear at all, they are effectively controlling which questions may be asked and which voices may be heard. Some younger scholars argue that true open knowledge must include even the most uncomfortable hypotheses, provided that they are supported by primary sources and are part of a legitimate scholarly discourse. Yet, most of these platforms still choose to take the easier route, applying warning labels, suppressing rankings, or quietly burying inconvenient results on page 10, where no one ever looks. And perhaps the most unsettling question of all is not whether these platforms are hiding something enormous, but whether now that the power of censorship has shifted from visible hands to invisible code, anyone still dares to ask, what piece of the puzzle are we missing? If modern forms of censorship on platforms like Wikipedia and Google Scholar are a product of the digital age, then during the stormy and paranoid decades of the Cold War, a more discreet and hands-on mechanism of control evolved. One where powerful intelligence agencies quietly partnered with archaeological expeditions. Following World War II, as the United States and the Soviet Union entered into a global and ideological confrontation, the field of archaeology suddenly became a strategic tool, a convenient means of accessing sensitive geopolitical zones under the innocuous cover of scientific research. Declassified files have now revealed that many international dig teams during this period were, in fact, dual-purpose operations, involved not only in archaeology, but also in gathering geographic data, mapping potential supply routes, and even recruiting local informants. One notable example of this was Project Mallory, a CIA-backed initiative that ran from the late 1940s through the 1960s. Presented to the public as a prehistoric cultural survey of Central Asia, the project allowed experts from the United States, Britain, and Germany to gain access to highly sensitive areas such as the Pamir Mountains and the Afghan border, regions that were then completely off-limits to most foreign press. While the project was publicly framed as being focused on Bronze Age research, declassified documents that were finally released in 1998 confirmed that these expeditions were also tasked with collecting data for satellite imagery, taking soil samples, and creating detailed logistical maps for potential military use. In the Soviet Union, archaeology was similarly entangled with geopolitics. During the 1950s, a series of major expeditions to Central Asia and Mongolia, which were overseen by the Soviet Academy of Sciences, were designed not only to explore ancient cultures, but also to legitimize Russia's historical dominance in the region. These missions were used to argue that these territories had always fallen within a civilizational zone of Russian influence. Some of the Soviet archaeologists who were involved in these projects later admitted that they also collected detailed ethnographic data, partly for academic study, and partly for the purpose of internal security profiling. The collaboration between archaeology and intelligence did not end in Asia. Across the Middle East, from Iran to Iraq and Syria, many Western archaeological teams, especially those from the United States and the United Kingdom, received indirect funding from covert government agencies. For example, the major excavations at the Sumerian sites in Iraq during the 1950s and 60s were formally managed by a cultural foundation, but budget records that were later revealed showed that up to 60% of their funding had actually come from the U.S. State Department and the CIA. The mission had dual goals: to document the priceless heritage of Mesopotamia and to monitor the activities of Soviet-aligned political factions in the region. In some cases, this arrangement had unintended positive benefits. These well-funded digs were able to uncover and preserve significant archaeological sites that might otherwise have been ignored or destroyed. But there was also a significant cost. Findings that did not align with the political agendas of the sponsoring agencies were often delayed, redacted, or were never published at all. One rarely discussed example of this is the Kalat Gadarban site in northern Iraq, where certain architectural features were found that suggested a historical timeline that was older than the officially accepted models. The early data from this site was withheld from publication, with officials citing military sensitivity and inconsistencies with approved historical frameworks. After the end of the Cold War, some historians began to ask some hard questions. Had the field of archaeology become a tool of state-sponsored myth-making? At a 1996 symposium, the historian Peter Manoulian remarked, "We must accept that sometimes, when we look at a photograph of an excavation, we are also seeing a political message." To this day, many of the archaeological project files from the period between 1945 and 1975 remain sealed in the archives of the CIA, MI6, and the GRU. Independent researchers who request access to these files usually receive polite but firm replies, such as "no relevant records found." And perhaps the most troubling aspect of this story is not that archaeology was used for intelligence purposes. That much seems almost inevitable during a period of global conflict. Is the dangerous precedent that such entanglements set. When science and political power merge, the boundary between genuine research and strategic propaganda dissolves, leaving behind a historical record that is blurred, distorted, and harder than ever to decipher. From burned libraries and sealed maps to ruined sites and vanished archaeological expeditions, one thing becomes undeniably clear. History has never been a fixed and unchanging monument. It is a powerful river, shaped by the forces of power, ambition, and fear, a river whose course has been quietly redirected over thousands of years. When an empire burns books, it does not just destroy parchment. It erases the collective memory of a people. When an academic board agrees to ignore inconvenient new findings, it is not just an act of caution. It becomes a wall that is built against independent thought. And when digital platforms label uncomfortable ideas as conspiracy, they are silently appointing themselves as the new gatekeepers of truth. Perhaps the most frightening thing of all is not the act of forgetting, but the way in which history is constantly rewritten again and again, with new layers of polish being applied until we can no longer tell what is evidence and what is merely an echo. In this journey, we have seen a series of unmistakable examples. The Olmec stone heads, bearing faces unlike any known Mesoamerican group, which have been rebranded as mere stylized artistic forms. The ancient world maps that depict a level of global knowledge that predates Europe's age of discovery, which were sealed away and removed from our textbooks. The archaeological film reels that were pulled from the archives under the vague label of sensitivity, ensuring that they would never be subjected to public scrutiny. And the small, inner circles within academia and the intelligence community that have quietly decided what gets funded, what gets published, and what gets taught, effectively pushing all inconvenient theories to the margins. And if all of this is true, then we must ask ourselves, is the history that we are taught built on a foundation of solid evidence, or is it built on a fragile consensus? Certainly, not every forgotten story is a grand conspiracy. Not every unconventional theory is correct, but not every doubt deserves to be dismissed either, because it is often those daring and disruptive questions that keep history alive, that keep it as a living dialogue, and not just a dusty manuscript that has been sealed away in the vaults of a bygone century. In the end, the most important question of all is not locked away in the Vatican archives, buried under the dust of the Library of Alexandria, or sealed in a safe at a forgotten dig site. It lies within each of us. Who gets to decide which story is told, which memory is preserved, and what version of the past will the next generation be taught to believe? If there is anything that is truly worth preserving, it is the courage to keep asking these questions, even when they make people uncomfortable. Because history is not dead. It lives in every debate, in every scrap of new evidence, and in every person who is brave enough to say, "I don't know if this is true, but I want to examine it for myself." If you have found this series of stories to be thought-provoking, please consider subscribing to this channel so that you do not miss what is coming next. And please leave a comment below. Who do you believe really writes history? Who holds the pen that has the power to redraw the past that we are all told to trust? Hit the notification bell and share this video so that more voices can join this vital conversation. Because the past truly belongs to those who are willing to question it, and the future belongs to those who are brave enough to listen.